Japan has sent a stark warning to Putin. Stop this senseless war or face the consequences. Tokyo has never been a fan of Russia, but this new round of help to Ukraine might have put the final nail in Putin's hope of reconciliation. Japan has always positioned itself as a partner to Ukraine, but now it's showing itself to be a very clear enemy of Russia. With new changes in its internal military policy, Japan is making it clear that it wants to end Russia and the war. Let's first go over Japan's current actions before looking at the rocky history between the two nations. The war has been going on for 2.5 years, but Russia has still been unable to take Ukraine down. The more time it takes to secure victory, then the more time the rest of the world has to back Ukraine up, and things are getting uglier for Putin. At this stage, hundreds of billions of dollars in military aid have been sent to Ukraine, and at the same time, NATO members have begun to rearm themselves to prepare for a possible conflict with Russia. Right from the onset, Japan has been very clear about where it stands. In 2023, Tokyo pledged $5.5 billion in humanitarian aid to Ukraine. Tokyo had previously pledged to send Kiev $600 million in financial assistance and $700 million in humanitarian aid, including medical supplies and food assistance. It also jumped on the strict sanctions bandwagon with all the other Western allies in 2022. On the media front, Japan has used every talking opportunity to show support for Ukraine. Before we dive in, please give this video a like and share our content with your friends. Pushing out geopolitical content isn't always easy, and we're constantly fighting bots that try to downvote our content. Little things such as liking our videos go a long way in keeping our content on your page. Prime Minister Fumio Kishida was quoted saying that Japan was in a position to lead the world's efforts to support Ukraine in its fight against Russia. This is because Japan truly believes that it's the duty of the international community to uphold a free and open international order based on the rule of law. He went on to add that Russia's aggression was not something that the European countries had to deal with, but a matter of global importance. Kishida also hosted an online summit of G7 leaders with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky after the first anniversary of Moscow's invasion and in preparation for the G7 summit in Hiroshima in May. Japan chose Hiroshima as the perfect venue for the summit to remind the powers of the atomic bombing that happened in World War II, and have everyone thinking about how Moscow's invasion of Ukraine was raising alarm bells of potential nuclear war. Kishida again reminded the G7 countries that Russia's actions meant that the threat of nuclear warfare was getting more real, and they needed to push more for nuclear disarmament. Japan did not just show its support in words, and in 2022, Tokyo expelled 9 Russian diplomats after news about mass killings in Bucha, Ukraine emerged. In February 2024, officials from Japan and Ukraine met to discuss a new investment treaty. Prime Minister Kishida held the Japan-Ukraine conference called the Promotion of Economic Growth and Reconstruction in Tokyo. The conference was about discussing how Japan would channel money into Ukraine for its war effort. During those treaty negotiations, Japan reaffirmed its vow to continue providing support to reconstruct Ukraine. A bilateral tax treaty was also created that codified a set of tax rules that would prevent double taxation of companies and individuals. This means that Japanese investors no longer have to worry about being taxed by both Ukraine and Japan. The effect of this is that the increase in investment is going to go into helping Ukraine rebuild. Japan also agreed to ease visa controls and to support Japanese venture capital countries in Ukraine. During his keynote address, the Prime Minister made a lot of good points, so we'll share part of the speech here. The war in Ukraine is still going on at this very moment, and the situation's not easy. The promotion of economic reconstruction, however, is not only investment for the future of Ukraine, but also investing in Japan and the whole globe. We must strive for the future of all of us. Japan, through both the public and private sectors, will provide robust support for economic reconstruction and industrial enhancement that will lead to the economic growth of Ukraine, a country with significant potential. It's our aim to support Ukraine so that the country can achieve comprehensive economic development from the primary to tertiary sectors, including in such key areas as agriculture, manufacturing, and the IT industry. He also continued to explain that this commitment was not a one-time thing, saying, The reconstruction of Ukraine will not be achieved overnight. The solidarity of the international community in this line of effort also needs to be strengthened. We'll work with our partners and international organizations and closely coordinate with the G7 and other countries. We'll make our measures and efforts closely in line with various developments in the international discussion, including an International Ukraine Recovery Conference to be hosted by Germany in coming June. It is the very interest of Japan and the international community as a whole that, overcoming the scars of Russia's aggression, Ukraine realizes its reconstruction and regains its vitality. We sincerely ask for the cooperation of all the participants gathering here for today's conference. After the conference, Ukrainian Prime Minister Denis Shmyhal later posted on social media platform Telegram stating that Japan would create a two-part program through which it would provide $1.35 billion in support to Japanese investors working in Ukraine. He also commented on the tax treaty, claiming that major Japanese car makers such as Toyota and Honda would be able to open factories in Ukraine. After the conference, Japan pledged to provide a further $12 billion in financial assistance. The total of Japan's financial investments has placed it in the top 5 countries in the world providing financial aid to Ukraine. Now, this is big news, but you might not have seen that news because a lot of traditional news organizations are not good at properly covering important geopolitics news. That's why we launched Global Recaps, a geopolitical newsletter that covers important geopolitical news in a simplified manner. Every evening, we send out an email directly to your inbox covering important stories that you can read in just a few minutes. Best of all of this is completely free, and you can sign up right now by clicking the link in the description or scanning the QR code. By continuing to work very closely with Ukraine, Japan is delivering a very clear message to Russia that it's not in support of what it's doing. Prime Minister Kishida has been hard at work, and again on April 11th, he delivered a speech to the US Congress. This opportunity was a big deal because only the closest of US allies get to speak to the Senate and the House. Kishida is also the second Japanese prime minister ever to address a joint meeting, after Shinzo Abe on April 29, 2015. Kishida first began by stroking Washington's ego and stating that the US leading the way on the global stage was indispensable. He also had to be strategic with this speech because there were deep differences in US politics about the role that America should play in the Ukrainian war. He also sympathized with America's position, as it always seemed that the duty to uphold international order always landed on it. In his speech, he said, "The leadership of the United States is indispensable. Without US support, how long before the hopes of Ukraine would collapse under the onslaught from Moscow? Without the presence of the United States, how long before the Indo-Pacific would have to face even harsher realities?" Kishida made sure to end the message with something for Putin, reiterating that Japan would continue to stand with Ukraine in the war.
It has also exported its ballistic missiles to support Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine, greatly increasing the suffering of the Ukrainian people.
This 2-year-long media campaign that Japan's been running for Ukraine already communicates that it's against Russia, but things have definitely amped up this year. In June 2024, Ukraine and Japan signed a 10-year security agreement. Up until this point, Japan had not been able to provide military aid because of constitutional constraints that stopped it. Now, after a negotiation and a revision of its guidelines, Tokyo will now be able to indirectly supply Kiev with weapons through the United States. Under this revision, Japan will be exporting Patriot air missiles to the United States to help Washington replenish its weapon stockpiles depleted by its military assistance of Ukraine. For the first time since 2014, this revision will allow the export of finished defense products to countries that hold patents for the equipment. At the same time, Tokyo has made it very clear that the Patriot missiles are for US stocks and not for transfer to a third country. The revised framework allows for license-built military gear to be transferred, but Tokyo has to give its approval first. Masashi Murano, a Japan chair fellow at the US-based Hudson Institute, explained how this benefits Kiev, saying, "If Japan transfers its Patriot PAC-3 missiles to the US and Washington exports the Patriots it already stocks to Ukraine, then this can indirectly support Kiev without affecting US air defense capacity." Japan stepping in to provide military assistance is a clear sign that it's gearing up for war. As if this wasn't enough, Japan will also provide Ukraine with $4.5 billion and will continue to support it through the agreement's entire 10-year term. Zelensky and Kishida have also agreed to set up a bilateral consultation framework to discuss a joint response within 24 hours of Russian armed attacks. Another way that Japan's made its feelings about Russia clear is through economic warfare. At the beginning of the war, Japan was one of the first to coordinate with the US and other G7 countries to implement sanctions. The first round of sanctions included asset freezes, restrictions on SWIFT payment access, and restrictions on the import and export of goods. In April 2022, Japan revoked Russia's most favored nation status alongside the US, UK, and the European Union. This status is a trade policy that gives a country privileged position in international trade and grants it certain benefits. These benefits include lower tariffs, reduced regulatory hurdles, and increased investment. After this, more sanctions came, more asset freezes followed, and more export bans as well. In early 2024, Japan joined the G7 countries in placing a price cap on Russian oil too. Then, in March, April, and June, Japan froze more assets and continued to squeeze Russia financially. We get that Japan wants to help Ukraine, but its exaggerated assistance has a lot to do with the terrible relationship it has with Russia. It's at this stage in the video that we dive into some of the problems that exist between Japan and Russia, and highlight that its support of Ukraine is more than just a belief in international order. The disagreement between the two nations goes back to World War II, when the Soviet Union seized the Kuril Islands, which are just 810 miles northeast of the Japanese island of Hokkaido. Ever since then, there's been hostility between the two nations, but things look like they might have gotten better in the early 2010s. Russia began to engage in talks with Tokyo, and it seemed that it might give the islands back to Japan. Japan's former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe spent most of his time trying to improve relationships between Japan and Russia and enable an agreement to be reached. This meant holding many diplomatic talks, joint tourism projects, and even talks about investment and economic development. In early 2019, Shinzo Abe and Vladimir Putin agreed to accelerate negotiations based on the 1956 document between the Soviet Union and Japan. The document stated that the Habomai Islets and Shikotan would be handed back to Japan, and the question of Kunoshiri and Etorofu would be settled during negotiations. After such productive conversations, Russia suddenly turned around and began to do its own thing. First, the Kremlin began to steadily increase its military presence in the northern territories, with satellite imagery showing Putin had been building infrastructure on the islands. The most shocking part is that construction comes as close as 14 miles to Hokkaido. In October 2020, Russia began to periodically conduct military drills on the islands and has plans to go further. The Kremlin also has plans to deploy T-72B3 battle tanks to the island so they could be used to destroy enemy forces and small enemy ships. Russia has also deployed S-300 V4 air defense missile systems to the territory. All of these actions make it clear that Moscow does not intend to hand the islands over. There's also been construction of barracks large enough to host a population of 7,000 on Kunashiri Islands, which justifies Japan's suspicions. The concern for Japan is the proximity to Japanese territory and Russia's continuous disregard for other nations' sovereignty. Russia's partnerships have also become a cause for concern for Japan. As China continues to grow as a global power militarily and economically, Japan's beginning to lose its position as the strongest power in the Indo-Pacific. Russia comes into this situation because of its alliance with China. Both China and Russia threaten the sovereignty of Japan, and now that they're cooperating, Japan's increased its suspicion of Russia. Russia's militarization of the islands also does not give Japan much faith either. What Japan's also afraid of is Russia's actions are paving the way for other ambitious countries like China to follow by invading Taiwan. Tokyo believes that Russia's actions are sending the wrong message, and in a speech given by Kishida in 2022, he said, "The invasion of Ukraine is a challenge that is not confined to Europe. It's a matter of the whole world, including Asia. Japan will work together with other nations and take actions with resolute determination, so that we would not be sending out the wrong message to the international community, so that using force to unilaterally control the status quo shall never be repeated." Although he did not say it directly, it's clear that Kishida was talking about China here. In our discussion, we also need to consider the fact that Japan's actions are not all pure. What Japan's hoping to achieve by supporting Ukraine is the same support in return. If China causes any problems in East Asia, Japan's hoping that Europe and the United States will remember the support it showed here and step in to assist. In the past, Japan's foreign policy used to be passive, but now it's become a lot more active in building global partnerships and influence. Public opinion back home also supports Japan's position, with 77% of the population believing that the international community needs to stop the Russian invasion. Another poll showed that 73.7% of the Japanese support the tough economic sanctions, even if it means that Japan suffers economically. With everything Japan's done so far, the overall approval ratings have also risen, and this is something that benefits Kishida in the long run. On the political front as well, Putin's allies are phasing out. These older politicians were on his side and believed that NATO's responses to Russia were provocative. However, the assassination of Shinzo Abe took away Putin's star ally from him. Abe worked hard to strengthen cooperation between the two countries and often referred to him as Dear Vladimir. Many also believe that his friendship with Putin is what stopped Japan from sanctioning Russia during the annexation of Crimea in 2014. Other former ministers like Yukio Hatoyama and Yoshido Mori no longer have the influence required to have any real impact on Japanese policy, so they're of no use. The first foreign politician to accept Putin, Muneo Suzuki, has also lost his influence due to his arrest for corruption and being thrown out of his own party. The new generation of politicians led by Prime Minister Kishida is steering the Japanese ship further away from Moscow. Russia's relationship with North Korea has also worked to push Japan away. In June 2024, North Korea and Russia signed a mutual defense pact. In this pact, Kim Jong-un and Putin signed an agreement that had a clause that called for the other nation to step in the case of aggression from other nations. By doing this, Putin has made it clear that he does not want a relationship with Tokyo. This is because North Korea represents a major threat to Japan in the Indo-Pacific, as Japan has strong ties with South Korea. This is why Kishida believes that Russia's problem is not a Europe-only problem, and wants everyone to wake up to this truth. In preparation for a large-scale war, it would be unwise to just focus on strengthening Ukraine without making preparations for your own nation. Currently, Japan is in the top 10 of the countries with global military power, and it's been competitively working to enter the top 5. There have been massive changes in Japan's defense budget under a radical new security strategy that will see the country investing 2% of its gross domestic product in the military over the next 5 years. To ensure a speedy response in times of conflict, the US and Japan have both updated their command and control arrangements. Along with this arrangement, Japan has also announced that they will create a permanent joint headquarters in Japan to allow the two countries to respond accordingly during a conflict. The US is also working towards creating something similar in the Indo-Pacific to help American military forces. Japan's arsenal is also quite advanced, and reports say that it's up to par with that of meganations like the UK and France. In 2023, the Japanese Ministry of Defense paid out $112 million for the purchase of Type 10 main battle tanks. The budget also had provisions for the purchase of the Type 19 self-propelled howitzer, which would be taken out of the 2024 budget. The Type 19 is a very special machine because it was designed with the ability to implement the shoot and scoot tactic. This allows it to rapidly fire and then relocate swiftly during combat. All of these new changes and purchases are a clear indication that Japan's preparing for the negative consequences that might come from assisting Ukraine. Let's also look at what Putin's response to this has been. In the beginning, he probably didn't expect that his invasion of Ukraine would cause such a negative reaction with Japan. After Japan announced that it would be providing its Patriot systems to the US, Russia kicked into gear and responded with the same threats it's been throwing at NATO and the UK. Russian Foreign Ministry spokeswoman Maria Zakharov commented on the situation, saying, "The Japanese side loses control over the weapons with which Washington can now do whatever it wants. It cannot be ruled out that under an already tested scheme, Patriot missiles will end up in Ukraine. Such a scenario would be interpreted as unambiguously hostile actions against Russia and will lead to grave consequences for Japan in the context of bilateral relations." If there was ever any hope of Russia and Japan working together again, the war with Ukraine has killed it. Japan is waking up to the realization that Putin's ambition knows no end, and if it's not careful, it could be the next Ukraine. On top of that, Russia's chosen to ally with all of Japan's enemies, making it clear exactly where it stands. The changes in its military policy are communicating that the time has come for countries to meet Putin's aggression with aggression of their own. Until the war ends, Japan will continue to fight with Ukraine, hoping that this will be the end of Russia.
Japan's Prime Minister Shigeru Ishiba, who has recently entered office, has a couple of requests for its allies: the creation of an Asian NATO and shared control of Washington's nuclear weapons as a deterrent against China, Russia, and North Korea. In an op-ed for the Hudson Institute, which is a Washington, D.C. think tank, Shigeru called for the setup of a NATO-style defense network that would push back against China's territorial ambitions in Asia. Clearly, there are two countries who are not fans of this idea, namely China and Russia. So in this video, we're going to dive into the real reason why Japan is pushing for an Asian NATO, and why it thinks having nukes is the only way to protect itself from some of its more aggressive enemies. Now, our content is not very popular with the CCP because of what we expose about their actions. Because of this, we are constantly fighting against bots that try to downvote our content and leave negative comments. You can help us out by liking our content and sharing it with your friends and family. Now, the way Japan sees it, Ukraine today is Asia tomorrow. Ukraine and Russia have been at war since February of 2022. And at this point, they are fighting a war of attrition. The entire world has had a front row seat to the devastation of Ukraine. And most of us do not want to see something like this happen again anytime soon. Ishiba compares China to Russia and sees Taiwan as the next Ukraine. His fear is that there is no agreement like the one NATO has to require Asian countries to come to Taiwan's defense. China will not be stopped. Ishiba's fears have been confirmed in how the US has dealt with Ukraine. Now, don't get me wrong, the US's support of its ally has been phenomenal. Military aid has been provided, and the White House has been one of the loudest condemners of Russia. However, the US has not fully stepped in, because according to US President Joe Biden, Ukraine is not a member of NATO, so there's no obligations to defend it. China's constant expansion into the Indo-Pacific region is happening at an alarming rate, and Japan is worried that a war could soon develop over Beijing's claims of Taiwan. After China deals with Taiwan, Tokyo is afraid that it will be next. Talking about existing security alliances, Ishiba wrote in his op-ed, if these alliances are upgraded, a hub-and-spoke system with the Japan-US alliance at its core will be established. And in the future, it will be possible to develop the alliance into an Asian version of NATO. But what is it about NATO that makes it something Ishiba thinks would work well for Asia? NATO, or the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, is a military alliance that was set up in 1949. At the center of NATO's mission is the principle of collective defense, which states that an armed attack against one or more members constitute an attack against all of NATO. Article 5 of the agreement triggers collective defense and creates an obligation on the member states to step in if a third party invades a NATO member state. The key principles of collective defenses are collective scrutiny, mutual defense, and solidarity. Such an alliance works really well against aggressors because it creates a deterrence that discourages them from attacking a NATO member state. Historically, Article 5 has only been triggered in response to the September 11th attacks in the United States. The solidarity shown during this was impressive, and everybody stepped in to support operations in Afghanistan. Since then, Article 5 has not been used yet, and this shows us that September 11th sent the message out loud and clear to aggressors. Japan's vision for this alliance would include Asian countries that are willing to come together against China's expansion in the area. If such an alliance were to be set up, it would work as a deterrent for China, as Beijing would have to think about whether it could sustain a war of collective defense. Let's talk about the nations that would most likely be in this alliance, and discuss how effective such an alliance would be. The Asian version of NATO would have to include all of China's enemies, as they would all share the same fears about China's aggression in the region. Top of the list would definitely have to be Taiwan, considering the fact that it is currently experiencing increased Chinese presence around the island. After a civil war in China, the KMT party left the mainland and set up a government on the island. Since then, China has vowed to reunite it with the rest of the PRC, despite Taiwan declaring its sovereignty. Taiwan would also make a lot of strategic sense, as it would be the buffer zone between China and the other members of the Asian NATO. Its proximity to China creates the perfect opportunity for it to be the grounds for monitoring or deploying in the case of a war. The strong ties that Taiwan has with the US will also greatly benefit the alliance. The US has been investing a lot in the Taiwanese military, and there has been a lot of Washington military presence on the island. Another good contributor would be the Philippines. Both Japan and the Philippines share similar concerns around China's aggression, and the Philippines has been at loggerheads with China for a while over the South China Sea. The Philippines also has a lot of influence in the Indo-Pacific region, meaning that it will bring its military prowess and experience to the table. The next potential partner would have to be India. India has already had enough of China in Bhutan, and an alliance like this would provide it a much-needed protection in case China tries to retaliate. India also has a lot to offer as a country. It has one of the fastest-growing economies in the world, and it holds major trade power in the East Asia region. According to Statistica, India has the second largest army and the third largest military budget in the world. Its arsenal also boasts top-of-the-range missiles, and it has a fast-growing naval stock. Geographically, India has a prime positioning in the Indian Ocean, and this means it controls a lot of shipping routes. An added plus is that India and Japan also have a very good relationship. And in 2014, they signed a special strategic and global partnership agreement that aimed to strengthen cooperation in defense and technology. Finally, let's throw South Korea into the mix. Its positioning on the Korean peninsula would be an advantage because it is perfectly placed around North Korea and China. This position would be more important in the case of a war. South Korea is also a player in the Indo-Pacific region, and its influence would greatly benefit the alliance. It has a well-equipped military and advanced technology, which would make it an asset to have in the alliance. These are the 4 countries that we have highlighted here, but there are many other options for an Asian NATO alliance, including Australia, based on the relationship it has with Japan. What a lot of countries in the Indo-Pacific region have in common is their beef with China, and their fear that China's expansion will push into their territories. Understanding that there is a regional need for collective defense is what has made Japan step forward and make this novel suggestion. Unfortunately for Ishiba, the idea was not received as well as he thought it would be. Now, recently we crossed 1 million subscribers. Ever since then, we have been flooded with emails asking us questions and asking for advice about growing a channel on YouTube. And even though we try our best to reply to every single email, sometimes these take up too much time or, they ask the same questions that we've answered before. So that's why we've decided to put all of our YouTube advice into one email boot camp for completely free. So if you're someone interested in starting your own YouTube channel, you can get our email bootcamp by clicking on the link in the description or scanning the QR code on the screen. Okay, let's get back to the video. What might even be a bigger blow for him is the fact that some of this pushback is coming from his own colleagues. Foreign Minister Takeshi Iwaya described the Asian NATO concept proposed by his boss, Ishiba, as a good idea, but one that should not be considered for now. In a report made by the Japan Times, Iwaya stated that such an alliance is not something that should be considered in the medium to long term. From his end, establishing a working framework for such an alliance would be difficult. The Japanese constitution would also make it impossible for such an arrangement to happen. According to Article 9, Japan is only permitted to use the minimum necessary force to defend its own territory. This is because Japan's military is a self-defense force. After its defeat in World War II, it had been restricted to matters in its own territory. This means that internally, before Japan could even begin to advocate for such an alliance, it would need to work on its constitution and amend this clause. Another rejection of the idea has come from India. On Tuesday, the Indian foreign minister expressed that India did not share the vision for an Asian NATO. Speaking at an event in Washington's Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, he explained that the country had never been a part of such alliances and they had no intention of entering one anytime soon. India feels that it has enough partnerships as it is already part of the Quad grouping of countries, which we'll discuss later. The US has also been commenting on the proposal and called it premature. These comments were made by Daniel Kritenbrink, the Assistant U.S. Secretary for State for East Asia and the Pacific. It's too early to talk about collective security in that context and more formal institutions. What we're focused on is investing in the region's existing formal architecture and continuing to build this network of formal and informal relationships. From the U.S.'s side, it makes more sense for Japan to focus its energy on building its current alliances. The idea of an Asian NATO is ambitious, and currently the US does not believe that Japan can pull one off. The problem that most nations have with the idea of a mutual defense agreement is the obligations they carry. Most Asian countries have a decent relationship with Japan and would welcome military agreements with the country. An Asian NATO carries a higher burden, and they do not want to be expected to defend Japanese interests if called upon. This is disappointing for Ishiba, but although Japan may not be able to get its Asian NATO soon, it has other good military alliances. Currently, Japan is part of the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, which is an alliance with Australia, India, and the United States. This alliance is not exactly written in stone, and it has been loosely interpreted by the countries in the alliance. For Japan, the importance was highlighting the democracy of all four states, while India was simply concerned with promoting cooperation. Australia has been on the outskirts for the most part, not wanting to seem invested in the alliance. In 2021, the alliance got a lot more serious about responding to China's actions in the region. Before that, it was concerned with humanitarian issues and climate change. In November of 2020, cooperation became active, and all four navies participated in a joint military exercise. From there, the countries began to convene meetings more regularly and to work together. During COVID, the four countries cooperated on issues to do with vaccines and the COVID-19 response. Japan has always had ambitions for the Quad group beyond its humanitarian aim. Former Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe believed that the Quad had the power to ensure a free and open Indo-Pacific. Japan understands the importance of keeping the sea lanes open for trade, and so the US and Japanese militaries have worked closely across the region. The problem for Japan is that the alliance is a loose agreement, and none of the other three nations would be rushing to step in if China turned its ambitions to Japan. It may not be an Asian NATO now, but the US is working to increase military cooperation in the Asian region. According to US Ambassador to Japan, Rahm Emanuel, the Biden administration is also working on a plan to create a special Asia-Pacific network of alliances. This agreement will see the US teaming up with Japan and the Philippines to foster cooperation in the case that a war breaks out with China. This agreement will allow for military exchanges, joint naval drills, and security aid packages. For now, Japan can rely on these types of agreements to provide some sort of protection against China if things escalate. Japan's Prime Minister Ishiba's other request was for control of Washington's nuclear weapons as a deterrent against China, Russia, and North Korea. Ishiba's vision for this area is that the Asian version of NATO would either be a part of America's sharing of nuclear weapons, or there would be the introduction of nuclear weapons into the region. Currently, NATO has a nuclear sharing agreement. This agreement is part of NATO's policy of nuclear deterrence, and it allows member countries without nuclear weapons of their own to participate in the planning for the potential use of nuclear power by member states that have nukes. The armed forces of these countries will be heavily involved in delivering nuclear weapons in the event of their use. And so the agreement basically prepares everybody for nuclear warfare. Parties to this nuclear sharing agreement carry out consultations and have decision-making power on nuclear weapons policy, including their maintenance, storage, and use. Ishiba basically envisioned something similar to apply to the Asian NATO. Japan's historical context means that it's limited in its ability to have nuclear weapons. The traumatic impacts of the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki mean that Japan has adopted a pacifist stance when it comes to nuclear warfare. This is understandable, considering the fact that historically, Japan is the only country to have been hit by nukes. Furthermore, post-World War II, the influence of the US and anti-nuclear sentiments internally have deterred Japan. Japan has also never needed to build a nuclear stockpile because of its mutual defense agreement with the US, which means that it is protected by the White House's nukes. What Ishiba is probably looking for from the US is a nuclear body like the one it has with South Korea. The existing Washington-Seoul nuclear body is for the preparation of potential nuclear contingencies caused by North Korea. The Japanese version would focus on preparing for nuclear threats from China and Russia. It also seems that the US has been receptive to the conversation, which is a relief for Ishiba. In July, Tokyo and Washington released a joint statement at their Security Consultative Committee meeting, outlining that they shared concerns over China's rapid expansion of its nuclear weapons arsenal, and agreed to strengthen its deterrence. James Schaaf, a senior director at the US-Japan Next Alliance initiative at the Sasakawa Peace Foundation USA, commented on this, saying, "The US ROK, Republic of Korea or South Korea, approach is probably a good example of where the US and Japan might go in the future if nuclear threats keep increasing. It's not about nuclear sharing or Japan building up its own nuclear forces. both politically impossible at the moment and not necessary, but about the alliance taking more practical steps to be prepared for US nuclear retaliation if it becomes necessary. The conversation around nukes has always been very touchy for Japan, but the changing military environment is making it a necessity for planning to happen. The government under Prime Minister Fumio Kishida was very anti-nukes, and it chose to stand on Japan's 3 non-nuclear principles: no possession, no permitting, no producing. However, in 2022, former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe stated that talks about nuclear sharing should not be considered taboo during a TV program talk. Tetsuo Fukuda, the chairperson of the ruling Liberal Democratic Party's, the LDP, General Council, commented on the discussion, stating that the debate about nukes was inevitable and should not be shied away from, especially when it has to do with protecting the Japanese people. LDP policy chief Sane Takaichi also backed this viewpoint, stating that discussion over whether to make an exception just when the safety of the people is in peril should not be suppressed. The debate within the country is intense. On the one hand, you have the Japanese Innovation Party, which recommends that the government needs to start discussing a review of the 3 non-nuclear principles and launch talks on nuclear sharing, especially in light of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. On the other hand, the Constitutional Democratic Party of Japan does not even want to hear the discussion, stating that debates about such things that step out of Japan's defense-only policy should not be entertained all of a sudden. The fear is also that if Japan enthusiastically pursues such conversations, the international community will get suspicious. Japan's stance on nuclear warfare is valid, but it needs to shift in light of the new threats on the horizon. China's acceleration as a nuclear powerhouse is alarming, and Japan may not be able to hide behind deterrence for much longer. According to the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, China now has an estimated 500 nuclear warheads, while a 2023 Pentagon report highlights that there have been a significant increase in China's operational nuclear weapons. This Pentagon report estimates an arsenal of over 1,000 warheads by 2030 and 1,500 by 2035. The thing that is scaring everybody about this situation is the sudden switch-up by Beijing. China did not care about nukes for a while, and it was not even a part of the global nuclear arms race, which began with the US and the Soviet Union. China's main priority was economic growth, and it only had a limited nuclear arsenal for defense purposes. Then, one day, everybody blinked, and China was rivaling countries like Russia and North Korea in relation to nuclear power. While China maintains that it is a part of team deterrence, the US has been keeping a close eye on it. There have been increased military, diplomatic, and economic pressures on Taiwan, Japan, and the Philippines, indicating that China is pushing for expansion. China's bold expansion plans are here because it claims it needs to push back against the US efforts to contain its rise. However, the increase in naval ship patrols, warplane movement, and military exercises shows that China is preparing for something bigger. As if China with nukes was not a big enough threat, there have been talks of Russia helping China expand its nuclear weapons program. Last month, US official Vipin Narang made the bold assertion that Russia, which has a contract to supply the highly enriched uranium, HEU, for Chinese reactors, is actually fueling China's nuclear weapons program. China has been working on switching to nuclear energy, stating that it is a cleaner source of power. Russia and China have an agreement in which Moscow provides China with uranium for its nuclear technology, but both nations state that it is very innocent. This agreement also includes a clause that states that China is not meant to use it for military purposes. The speculation is that China is secretly using the supply for nuclear weapons program, which is not too far-fetched an idea considering the nature of the two powers. On top of the growing threat from China, Japan also needs to think about the suspicious cooperation between Russia and North Korea as nuclear powerhouses. There have been rising concerns that Moscow is sharing nuclear expertise with North Korea in exchange for artillery and missiles. Despite these speculations, there have been no proof of these claims yet. Even if it turns out that these claims are false, individually, the two nations pose enough of a threat for Japan to think about reopening the nuclear debate. Putin's rhetoric in the past couple of months has placed a lot of the West on high alert. In the ongoing Russia-Ukraine war, Russia has made it clear that it would be using its nuclear weapons if the US or NATO directly intervened on Ukraine's behalf. Russia already has an impressive nuclear arsenal, which is complete with the nuclear triad: but it is still at work modernizing it and adding to what it has. Russia has been in this nuclear race for a very long time, and began acquiring nuclear weapons in 1949, when it developed a triad of strategic bombers, intercontinental ballistic missiles, or ICBMs, and nuclear-powered ballistic missile submarines. Because Russia has had more time to develop its arsenal, it is now focusing on early warning infrastructure and modernizing its stock, while many other countries are still focusing on building an arsenal. About 13.5% to 16% of its defense spending goes to its nuclear weapons program, and more money has been reportedly poured into nuclear spending to develop new warheads. A stock take of Russia's nukes estimates that Russia has 4,489 deployed and non-deployed nuclear warheads assigned to strategic and non-strategic delivery vehicles. Of this number, about 2,000 warheads are intended for nuclear security, non-proliferation, and weapons. U.S. intelligence believes that as Russia gets more desperate, it will likely turn to nuclear weapons in the future. Currently, its army is devastated and its economy is fighting to keep up with the rising military expenditure. Russia has not been hiding its intentions, and its government has stated, "The Russian Federation reserves the right to use nuclear weapons in response to the use of nuclear and other types of weapons of mass destruction against it or its allies, as well as in the event of aggression against the Russian Federation, with the use of conventional weapons when the very existence of the state is in jeopardy." North Korea has also been on the radar, especially now during Kim Jong-un's reign. Under his leadership, North Korea has conducted 6 nuclear tests and hundreds of tests of short, medium, and long-range missiles. In April of 2023, North Korea tested a Hwasong-18 intercontinental ballistic missile with a solid fuel propellant for the first time. It has been silent about a lot of its nuclear program, but this test showed that North Korea had been working on a critical upgrade that would make the missiles easier and safe to operate. This move put North Korea on everybody's danger radar. Currently, North Korea has been focusing on the development of its ICBMs, making it a direct threat to Japan and the USA. As the nuclear underdog, North Korea has been working on developing an arsenal that includes strategic and tactical ballistic missiles and multiple delivery systems. In developing its launch systems, North Korea has been working towards having ground and sea-launched missile systems and prioritized mobile-based systems. The rough estimates suggest that North Korea has around 40 to 60 nuclear warheads, with some saying that it could have as many as 100 warheads in its current inventory. Japan may want to be in denial about it, but the truth is that a nuclear war is imminent. Its past should be what makes it more active in the nuclear conversation. Its pacifist policy, which made sense post-World War II, does not make sense when global powers are arming themselves with nuclear weapons. A revising of its law around nukes and the creation of a nuclear sharing program will help Japan safeguard itself from nuclear escalation. While the debate will go on internally, Prime Minister Ishiba has already set out his intentions as a leader. Right at the beginning of his term of office, Prime Minister Shigeru Ishiba has made it pretty clear what his intentions are for Japan's foreign policy. Currently, the alliances that he has with countries like India, the US, and Australia seem inadequate for the rising threat that is China. Internally, there's still a lot of debate about whether Japan is ready to begin nuclear sharing or whether there should be an Asian NATO. The general consensus seems to be that it is way too soon for the conversation on both matters. While his government may feel that way, Ishiba has an understanding that things are changing swiftly, and that the pacifist policy that Japan once knew was not going to offer the support needed. August 26, 2024. Around 11:30 a.m., Japan's self-defense force put its fighter jets on high alert. The reason? An enemy aircraft had invaded Japanese airspace. It was a Chinese military Y-9 intelligence gathering aircraft that was detected near Japan's Danjo Islands, after which Japan issued a warning to the Chinese aircraft. This is the picture of the aircraft that the Japanese Ministry of Defense provided. According to the Japanese Defense Ministry, this was the Chinese military's first known invasion into its territorial airspace. The harsh truth why China keeps doing this to Japan is because it is militarily far more superior than Japan. In fact, it's not just China. 2 other nuclear powers could also wreak havoc on Japan at any time. But this sentence would become irrelevant in the next few years because what Japan is doing will blow your mind, and Japan's enemies are hating it. 23rd of December, 2022. The Japanese cabinet announced a budget that surprised the entire world. It made global headlines. as it was the first time since World War II that the world had seen something like this.
Prompting Japan to pump up defense spending, raising it by more than 27% to around $50 billion. The long-standing pacifist nation now third behind the US and China.
In December of 2022, Japan announced its 2023 budget, but what shocked the world was that Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida approved a whopping 6.8 trillion yen, or about $51.4 billion, to upgrade their military. This was a 26.3% increase in defense spending compared to 2022, and its largest military budget increase since World War II. Not just that, this sleeping giant has even taken bold moves to become one of the top military powers in the next few years. As of 2024, Japan is the 8th largest military spender globally. But not anymore, because things are about to change dramatically and fast. On December 16, 2022, Japan unveiled its biggest military buildup with its $320 billion 5-year defense plan that will make Japan the world's 3rd largest military spender after the United States and China. And these preparations are aimed at countering some of the most significant threats that have not only emerged but continue to grow around Japan. It even published a document on its national security strategy that has mentioned the measures it would take to counter its threats.
Japan is abandoning its pacifism, all while firmly being aligned with the US.
So the question is, what instigated a pacifist nation like Japan to take such a bold move? What are Japan's biggest threats, and how is Japan planning to counter them? But before we dive in, know that the countries we are going to be exposing might not like this and could use their bots to suppress this video. But you can help us fight back by hitting the like button. This boosts the video in the algorithm and it reaches more people. Alright, now let's begin the video. After World War II, Japan remained as a peaceful nation, avoiding involvement in any major conflicts. In fact, Article 9 of the Japanese Constitution contains a no-war clause. And this basically means that Japan will not use war or military force in settling international disputes. It has formally renounced war as a sovereign right. This article came into effect on May 3, 1947, immediately after World War II. This can even be seen in their military budgets announced over the years. According to data, Japan spent more than 1% of their GDP decades back in 1960. After 1960, this number was less than 1% of their GDP, but things started changing, and this number finally exceeded 1% in the 2020 budget. But according to the goal it is outlined in its 2022 National Security Strategy, Japan is all set to increase this number to 2% of its GDP in the next few years. In fact, Japan is even walking the talk. In 2023, Japan spent 1.2% of their GDP on defense. This number increased to 1.6% in 2024, which was 55.9 billion USD. It is expected to rise by 0.2% year on year over the next 5 years till it reaches the 2% mark. So the question is, what suddenly instigated Japan to make such ambitious defense plans? The simple answer to this is that Japan didn't suddenly wake up and realize that it has to strengthen its military. It started realizing this after numerous events that took place over a period of multiple years. So this move was inevitable, and it finally happened in 2022. And these threats are some of the most dangerous a nation can face, to the point where they could even undermine the country's sovereignty, something like a ballistic missile flying over your country or enemy missiles landing in nearby ocean waters. Seems scary, right? We'll soon discuss these incidents in detail, but this is what Japan has been facing. Japan has been dealing with serious threats from 3 nearby countries. These countries are China, Russia, and North Korea. And a defense document released by the United States in October of 2022 described China as a pacing challenge, Russia as an acute threat, and North Korea as a persistent threat. Although this assessment was made in the context of the United States, it is almost equally relevant in the case of Japan. To break it down into simpler terms, China is viewed as a pacing challenge. This means that China is a major competitor that is rapidly expanding its power and influence on the world stage. Russia is seen as an acute threat, meaning it poses a direct and immediate danger to the security and interest of its adversaries, and North Korea is viewed as a persistent threat. which simply means that North Korea is a long-standing and ongoing threat due to its nuclear weapons program and ballistic missile development. These may sound simple, but they might become existential threats to Japan. And I mean it. Starting with our dear friend China, which reports an average defense budget of over $200 billion, it might actually be 3 times that amount. Because according to a US think tank, China spent $710.6 billion USD on its military budget in 2024, compared to the $229 billion it officially reported. China, which possesses 410 nuclear warheads as of 2023, could more than triple this number to 1,500 by 2035. Although these nukes are a huge threat to Japan, what has become a headache for Japan are actually the notorious Chinese incursions to intimidate Japan and insert its growing military power in the region. For example, military analysts suggest that the latest example of airspace invasion we saw in the beginning might be China's way of challenging Japan's borders. China claims control over a large area of the continental shelf, not just in the South China Sea, but also on the East China Sea. And this incursion into Danzhou Island's airspace also occurred in the East China Sea as well. We will discuss all these issues shortly, but the latest case of airspace invasion we saw wasn't the only case. Over the past 20 years, Japan has faced more and more foreign aircraft intrusions. Last year, Japan's self-defense force sent fighter jets 669 times to intercept foreign planes, which is more than triple the number from 20 years ago. Surprisingly, out of these 669 cases, 479 cases, which is a whopping 71.6% of the cases, were in response to Chinese aircraft sightings, as reported by Japan's Ministry of Defense. On top of that, Japan has been intensifying its activities across the entire region surrounding Japan, including the East China Sea, particularly around the Senkaku Islands, the Sea of Japan, and the Western Pacific Ocean, including areas near the Izu and Ogasawara Islands. In fact, the largest ever military exercise China conducted in the Taiwan Strait on the 4th of August 2022 was one of the most controversial military exercises. This is because 5 ballistic missiles out of the 9 ballistic missiles fired by China during this exercise landed within Japan's exclusive economic zone. This was perceived as a threat to local residents. This might initially look like a coincidence since the Taiwan Strait is very close to the Japanese waters, but it was actually a very strong message to Japan. And China actually had a very strong reason to send this message. In fact, the entire military exercise, not just this event, was meant to convey a powerful message to the world. Surprisingly, the reason behind this exercise, and even most of the enmity between Japan and China, is actually Taiwan. Yeah, you heard that right. Taiwan is one of the major reasons behind Japan's and China's conflict. Now you may ask, how has Taiwan become a reason behind their conflict? Actually, this is the reason.
Now to the escalating tensions between the U.S. and China, with House Speaker Nancy Pelosi meeting with Taiwan's president overnight. China accusing the U.S. of playing with fire.
On August 2nd of 2022, U.S. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi visited Taiwan in a significant show of support for the island nation. This was so significant because she was the highest-level U.S. official to visit Taiwan in 25 years. But China was so enraged just by the idea of the US official's visit to Taiwan that even before she visited Taiwan, China literally said that its military will never sit idly by if she visits Taiwan. Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson Zhao Lijian even threatened serious repercussions. He said, and I quote, "There will be serious consequences if she insists on making the visit." But even after these threats, Nancy Pelosi made the visit. But what China did later was one of the biggest military exercises. Just 2 days after her visit, China conducted its largest ever military exercise in the Taiwan Strait. And this was the same military exercise where the missiles landed in Japan's exclusive economic zone. This exercise also began just hours after China canceled a planned meeting between its foreign minister and Japan's, due to its anger over a G7 statement urging China to resolve Taiwan tensions peacefully. Now you might ask, if this is mostly China's, the US's, and Taiwan's issue, then where is Japan in this picture? And how could the Taiwan issue become a major challenge for Japan? The answer lies in the location of Japanese islands. If we see the map of Japan, we generally know just the mainland of Japan. But in reality, it has multiple islands that are very close to Taiwan and China. In fact, some of these islands are so close to Taiwan that the Yonaguni Island is just 110 kilometers, or about 68 miles away from Taiwan, and this makes it the nearest Japanese island to Taiwan. Although this island is not militarized yet, Japan is planning on building a military base on Yonaguni and extend the airport and port, considering the potential threat from China in case it attacks Taiwan. But the main island that poses a real threat to China is not the Yonaguni Island, but the Okinawa Island. This is because Okinawa alone hosts 32 US military bases, which includes 30,000 active troops from the USA. In fact, Okinawa makes up just 1% of Japanese landmass, but hosts 70% of all US military bases in the country. But the thing that intimidates China the most is the fact that this island is just 509 kilometers, or about 316 miles, from mainland Taiwan. So in case of a conflict between the US and China on the Taiwan issue, these islands are bound to get dragged into the conflict, and even the civilians would suffer. Now, Japan, being one of the NATO partners in the Indo-Pacific region, would definitely back the US in case of a conflict. So China would definitely try to prevent a US counterattack from its Japanese bases. So Japan, especially the Japanese islands, could be dragged into this Taiwan conflict. So to prevent any Chinese aggression on Japan territories, Japan has to upgrade its military capabilities. But there's another lethal threat that China poses to Japan in case of a conflict. If China attacks Taiwan and threatens nearby Japanese islands, they're worried that this will disrupt the supply of advanced semiconductors and block sea lanes that supply oil to Japan. This is because almost 95% of the oil imported by Japan comes from the Middle East. On top of that, Japan is the world's largest importer of liquefied natural gas. Another reason a conflict could be disaster for Japan is that either it would put their key maritime shipping lane into the line of fire, or China would block them. In fact, it's not just about energy. Japan is highly dependent on the import of natural resources as well. For example, Japan is the largest net buyer of food products in the world. Additionally, China's growing ambitions in the South China Sea and the entire region surrounding Japan, including in the East China Sea, is also a threat to Japan. So it becomes extremely important for Japan to protect its trading routes, and for this, it would undoubtedly need a strong military. The Taiwan issue isn't the only reason behind the bitterness between Japan and China. There's something that goes decades back in the past during World War II. Today, Japan is much smaller compared to the peak Japan of a few decades ago. Because this is what Japan looked like at its peak. This empire at its peak encompassed a vast territory spanning across East Asia and Southeast Asia. It included large portions of China, the entire Korean peninsula, Taiwan, the Philippines, parts of Indonesia, Malaysia, Brunei, Singapore, Myanmar, and Thailand. They also controlled numerous islands in the Pacific Ocean, including the Mariana Islands, Caroline Islands, Marshall Islands, and parts of the Solomon Islands. These territories were collectively known as the South Seas Mandate, which Japan received after World War I as a League of Nations mandate. However, the degree of Japanese control varied across these territories, with some areas experiencing direct rule and others governed indirectly through puppet regimes or military occupation. As you can see in the map, it also shows a huge portion of present-day China under Japanese control. This included the northeastern region of Manchuria, which they had annexed to form the puppet state of Manchukuo. Additionally, Japan occupied large areas of northern China, including major cities like Beijing and Tianjin. Yeah, you heard that right. Japan once controlled the present-day capital of China. They also controlled parts of central and eastern China, extending their influences to cities such as Nanjing, Wuhan, Shanghai, and Ningbo. Although Japan had huge areas under its control at its peak, its methods of occupation were often brutal and inhumane. Japan committed numerous war crimes, including mass killings, torture, and the use of forced labor. They forced hundreds of thousands of women into sexual slavery. On top of that, a notorious Japanese biological warfare unit known as Unit 731 conducted extremely horrific experiments on prisoners of war and civilians. This unit was part of the Japanese Imperial Army, and their experiments were carried out primarily at a specific research facility unit located in Harbin, China. One such region where the Japanese committed horrific war crimes was the city of Nanjing. On December 13, 1937, during World War II, the Japanese troops attacked China and captured the city of Nanjing, after which more than 300,000 victims were brutally killed by the Japanese troops. In fact, the Nanjing Massacre was one of the 3 large-scale massacres of World War II. Even after decades, China has deep scars from this incident, and this can be proven by the fact that China declared December 13th as a national memorial day for the victims of the Nanjing Massacre. In fact, this is such a critical issue that Global Times, the mouthpiece of the CCP, published an article with this headline, which says that China-Japan ties are under reconsideration on National Memorial Day. Additionally, even Chinese schools and universities teach about the atrocities committed by Japan during the war. So this is a very sensitive topic for the Chinese, and another reason for the hate against the Japanese. The third reason is an ongoing conflict for the disputed islands called Senkaku in Japanese and Diaoyu in Mandarin. These islands are currently a part of Japan, but China claims it as their territory. And China is in no mood to back off from these claims. This can be proven by the fact that Chinese government ships keep entering Japanese territorial water near the disputed islands. In fact, according to a Japanese broadcaster, NHK, China has made 23 incursions in 2023 alone. Analysts say that China's ongoing military aggression in the region, including joint patrols with Russia around Japan, justifies Tokyo's efforts to strengthen its defense capabilities. And you heard that right. Japan is also dealing with the second largest military power, Russia, and even they have had some bitter ongoing disputes for decades.
Japan's Prime Minister has lashed out at Russia's president, saying that Dmitry Medvedev's visit to a disputed island chain is deeply regrettable. It's the first visit by a Russian leader to the region, which has been a source of tension for the two nations for 65 years.
At the end of World War II, Russia captured 4 islands of the Kuril island chain from Japan. And these were Kunashiri, Etorofu, Shikotan, and the Habomai Islands. On the other hand, Japan claims these islands as its northern territories. Multiple attempts were made to resolve this issue, but the Kuril Islands have remained a disputed territory since no formal peace treaty has been signed by both Japan and Russia since the Second World War. Both these countries have discussed this issue for decades to reach an agreement, but to no avail. But at one point, some level of success was achieved through discussions between the top leaders of both countries. For example, the conflict eased in 2016, when the two countries agreed on joint economic activities, including tourism projects on the islands and visa-free visits for Japanese citizens. Just 2 years later, former Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe proposed splitting the islands and returning 2 of them to Japan. But Putin obviously rejected this proposal. But even at this point, the situation didn't worsen as it is now. It worsened because of the event that became the talk of the town, the Russia-Ukraine conflict. This is because when this conflict began in February of 2022, Japan imposed sanctions on Russia, which ended their economic cooperation around the islands. In response to these sanctions, Russia stopped peace treaty talks over the Kurils, ended an agreement that protected Japanese fishing vessels from being seized around the islands, and held a military exercise on the islands to practice defending against an invasion. These tensions reached a new level on September 3rd, when Russia revoked an agreement that allowed former Japanese residents of the islands visa-free visits. At the same time, the Vostok 2022 naval exercise, which included joint operations with China, took place on the islands. Now, the reason that makes these islands an even bigger threat for Japan is that Russia has militarized these islands. In fact, Russia has increased its permanent military presence on these islands since at least 2015. Russia has built airstrips, barracks, deployed surface-to-air missile systems, and even deployed an estimated 3,500 troops. In December of 2021, Russia announced the deployment of more Bastion missiles on an island in the middle of the Kuril chain, known as the Matua Island. And this was extremely concerning for Japan, because this island is just 450 miles away from Japan. It might seem that Russia poses a significant threat to Japan, given the fact that it has the second most powerful military in the world, the highest number of nuclear weapons, and advanced military technology that could inflict substantial damage on a country with a comparatively weaker military. But the reality is far different. Russia is already engaged in Ukraine and has spent a lot of money and resources there. So opening another front with Japan is almost next to impossible for Russia for one simple reason. Japan's GDP is $4.2 trillion, and that of Russia is just $2.021 trillion. So it's difficult for Russia to spend a huge chunk of money on another front. So Japan's economy is almost twice the economy of Russia's. Now, this obviously doesn't mean that Japan should underestimate Russia. Again, not to forget the fact that Russia has very close ties with Japan's biggest threat, China. But the headache for Japan doesn't end here. It has challenges from one more nation run by a person who loves nukes more than anything else, apparently. Yeah, you must have guessed it. It's none other than the dictator of North Korea, Kim Jong-un. This one incident is enough to prove how dangerous the situation is. In October of 2022, North Korea launched a ballistic missile that passed over Japan's Tohoku region. And according to Japan's Chief Cabinet Secretary, Hirokazu Matsuno, this region is home to more than 8 million people. And in case the test had failed and the missile had fallen short, it could have endangered major population areas. These two countries have unresolved issues, such as the abduction of Japanese citizens by North Korea and the status of the Korean peninsula. From about 1977 to 1983, North Korean military and intelligence operatives kidnapped at least 17 Japanese citizens from Japan. These tensions still exist. The shocking fact is that North Korea has repeatedly tested intercontinental ballistic missiles. In fact, from just 2019 to 2023, North Korea has conducted more than 130 missile tests, and most likely it will continue this trend. The more concerning fact is that North Korea has 50 nuclear weapons as of 2024. So the North Korean dictator is not only increasing the numbers, but also improving the range of these weapons. The fact that makes North Korea a more dangerous country is its improving ties with Russia and China. Because just a few months ago, Putin visited North Korea and signed a pact according to which both of them would provide immediate military assistance if either faced armed aggression. And not to forget China's role, since Chinese assistance has proven vital for North Korea and helped them in their nuclear program. So, to tackle all these challenges, Japan has planned to deploy multiple weapons, each with a particular use case. The Japanese Defense Ministry wants to build 2 warships, which will have the radar capacity to intercept North Korean missile launches. To counter China, it plans to acquire 500 long-range, US-made Tomahawk cruise missiles, which are capable of striking deep inside of Chinese territory. It also has focused on improving amphibious warfare. This is basically its ability to quickly move its troops from the ocean onto the beach. On top of that, it is also focusing on building a chain of new military bases along these southern islands with the US's support. Japan's plan is simple. By fiscal year of 2027, Japan aims to enhance its defense capabilities so that it can handle invasion on its own and effectively counter such threats, with support from their allies. In about 10 years, it plans to further improve its defenses to detect and defeat invasions even earlier and from a greater distance. Now, it's only a matter of when we will witness Japan becoming a military superpower.
China's territorial ambitions know no end, and this time, it has its eye on Japan. Recent suspicious activities that have occurred in the East China Sea show that China's looking to invade Japan. Recently, a Chinese staffer who was working for Japan's broadcasting organization NHK declared that the Senkaku Islands in Okinawa are actually Chinese territory. Then, again in August, a Chinese Y-9 reconnaissance plane was intercepted flying over Japanese territory in the East China Sea, declaring dominance. In this video, we're going to talk about all these incidents that point to an invasion of Japan by China. We'll also look at why China has ambitions in Japan, and how Japan's preparing for a potential war with Beijing. Topics like this aren't the algorithm's favorite, but we're committed to providing you with informative content. To help us fight against the CCP bots, please give this video a like and share it with your friends and family too. Right, let's get into today's topic. The 40-year-old Chinese staffer who made this bold statement had been working under the NHK since 2002. And his job was to translate Japanese news into Chinese and read the text on live radio. On this particular day, during his delivery of the news script on air, he went off script and stated that the Senkaku Islands in Japan's Okinawa prefecture are Chinese territory. In his rant, he went on to say, "I could not allow the Japanese government and media to deny the history of invasion and glorify militarism." He further claimed that NHK's news telling was whitewashed, stating, "I always felt opposed to NHK's bullshit way of ignoring the truth of history." NHK was completely taken aback by the comments and terminated his contract on the spot. While the comments and controversy came out of nowhere, the views of the Chinese staffer are a reflection of popular opinions in China. The timing of the staffer's outburst is also interesting, considering China's movements around the islands. Because China has such strong feelings about the ownership of the islands in Okinawa, it's no surprise that it has intentions of invading the region. There have been many reports of China sending aircraft and ships to the region for military intelligence gathering. In a particular incident in August, the intelligence-gathering aircraft entered Japan's territorial airspace around some remote islands in the East China Sea. The Y-9 reconnaissance plane first began by flying in a rectangular circuit pattern on the eastern side of the Danzhou Islands before heading west and crossing into territorial airspace. The Japanese Defense Ministry says it immediately sent out Air Self-Defense Force fighter jets to respond to the alleged intrusion, but no confrontation with the Chinese plane was reported. Although the violation of Japan's airspace was very brief, Japan wasn't having any of it. Chief Cabinet Secretary Yoshimasa Hayashi explained that the action by the Chinese military was a serious violation of territorial rights and a direct threat to Tokyo. Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson Lin Jian claimed that the incident was a mistake and China had no intention of violating the country's airspace. The spokesperson also claimed that there were ongoing investigations going on in China to figure out what happened. Japan has become very concerned in the past couple of years because of China's increased activity around Japanese waters and airspaces. The Danzhou Islands, where China's reconnaissance plane was seen, are an important Japanese national monument and wildlife protection area. These islands are in the East China Sea and are just 100 miles or 160 kilometers from the Japanese main island of Kyushu. The island's proximity to the mainland makes the actions by China more of a threat than just a mistake. The fight for the Senkaku Islands of Okinawa has been a long and complex one that has left both Japan and China sour. The tension had seemed to simmer down, but in June 2023, Chinese President Xi Jinping publicly spoke on the situation, stating that there were historical ties between Okinawa and China. His statement was passed boldly in an article published by the Chinese Communist Party's main newspaper, The People's Daily. The specific article also emphasized China's territorial claim to the Japanese Senkaku Islands, further fueling the fire. The rehashing of the conversation hints at the possibility that China is working on a plan to take the land that it believes is part of its territory. Before we go into the history between China and the islands, let's talk about its geography. The uninhabited chain of islands are rocky and span over 1,200 miles or 1,900 kilometers to the southwest of Tokyo. These islands happen to be much closer to China, as they're about 205 miles or 330 kilometers from China's east coast. China's been holding on to its grudge about the islands for a very long time. Before Japan annexed Okinawa in 1879, China and Okinawa were closely linked. The two states shared a lot of culture and religion, and many Chinese people migrated to the island. The state did not belong to China then, but China felt that it was part of its territories. After World War II, the US took over the island, and it was placed under its administration. Later on, in 1972, it was given back to Japan and placed under Tokyo's control. Currently, Okinawa is what is known as a prefecture. Prefectures hold some autonomy of their own, but are linked to a nation. In other countries, a prefecture would be the same as a state or province. These provinces have local autonomy, but rely on the central state mainly. Japan has 47 prefectures, and they're governed similarly to the states in the US. This particular dispute in Okinawa is over 5 islands, namely Utsurijima, Taishaojima, Kubajima, Kitakojima, and Minami Kojima. Although Japan administers these islands as part of Okinawa, both the People's Republic of China and Taiwan claim ownership of the island. Beijing's first issue came in 2012, when Tokyo bought the islands from a Japanese owner. China felt that this was a disregard for its claim and an attack on its sovereignty. In 2013, China suddenly announced that it would be creating a new air defense identification zone on the East China Sea. The zone would require countries flying in the area to identify themselves and follow special Beijing procedures before they could proceed. Both Japan and the US ignored this order, and Japan considered it a unilateral escalation. China's obsessive claim of the islands is also connected to the idea that it owns all the territories in the South China Sea. Based on these claims, China has drawn its own boundaries and set its own rules. After seeing people were ignoring its claims, China became more aggressive. In early 2022, the Chinese Coast Guard and naval ships began spending a suspicious amount of time in the waters around the Senkakus. On one occasion, a People's Liberation Army Navy frigate entered the waters in a contiguous zone. This zone is between the islands but not in any nation's territory. This means that no one was breaking any laws by moving in it, but the increase in activity was suspicious. In a menacing way, China's Coast Guard and its other vessels have been sent into the waters to assert China's claim and to look out for movement in the region. According to the Japanese government, China has maintained a presence in the area for 158 days. The dispute over the territories has led to some fights between Chinese and Japanese coast guards. According to China, its coast guards had to warn Japanese ships that were allegedly intruding into waters around the East China Sea. These fights normally break out because both sides are frequently patrolling the contested waters. In June 2024, China claimed that it had driven away 4 Japanese fishing boats and patrol boats for control reasons. Japan claimed that 2 Chinese Coast Guard ships in the area tried to bully Japanese fishing vessels that were operating in waters around the islands. Japan has even reported that it sighted a Chinese nuclear-powered submarine in the area. Outside of naval movements, Chinese aircraft have also been seen in the area. A propeller plane and a small drone have been seen around the Senkaku Islands. It may seem strange, but the fights for the islands make sense, considering the territory's significance. The area provides rich fishing grounds with prime seafood, including tuna and squid. The islands also lie pretty close to oil and gas reserves and important shipping lanes that are critical for trade with the US, Asia, and Europe. From a military perspective, the islands also have a lot to offer. Because of their location, they would be the perfect place for military bases, which would control territorial safety from those points. This position will allow for monitoring, and it would deter other forces that move around the waters. Some people may think that claiming that China wants to invade Japan based on these incidents is an exaggeration, but there's a lot to show that China is indeed looking for war. The first thing that many may find trivial is the fact that China's out for revenge. In a lot of ways, China attributes its embarrassment and fall to Japan in its different eras. China's century of humiliation was a time when Beijing experienced loss after loss, and some of those losses were at the hands of Japan. In this century, China lost a lot of territories and dropped its titles as a dynasty. Let's take a look at 2 significant battles between Japan and China. In 1894, both the Qing dynasty and Japan's Meiji government claimed the Korean peninsula. After fighting all the way to 1895, Japan won the fight, and China was forced to give up Taiwan, Dalian, Penghu Islands, and Lushunkou. This loss increased Japan's Indo-Pacific influence and crashed the Qing dynasty completely. As if one war wasn't enough, the Second Sino-Japanese War came between 1937 and 1945. Japan had invaded Manchuria, and China was fighting hard to resist Japan's aggression in the area. Although Japan eventually surrendered after US intervention, a lot of damage had been done. An estimated 20 million Chinese people died during the war, and a lot of its infrastructure was destroyed. The legacy of war between the two nations makes it clear that it's only a matter of time before there's another war between the two countries. China's other reason for war has to do with Japan meddling in its matters with Taiwan. Japan has a history with Taiwan because China ceded it to Tokyo after the First Sino-Japanese War. After 1945, Taiwan was returned to China, but in 1949, mainland China was split from Taiwan. During the Chinese Civil War in the country, which was fueled by differing ideologies, the tension reached an all-time high. The two parties, the Communist Party of China and the Nationalist Party, could not coexist in the same place. So the CPC stayed on the mainland and established the People's Republic of China, and the KMT went off to Taiwan to set up the Republic of China. Since then, CCP has vowed to reunite the two again under one central government. Unfortunately, there's been opposition in the form of Japan and the US. For the most part, Japan has stayed out of China's drama with Taiwan and considered the issue to be political. However, since 2021, Japan has become more vocal about standing up for Taiwan. This is because China has become increasingly aggressive in the area, and even went as far as sending fighter jets and warships to the island. The further China moved into the area, the bolder Japan got. Japan has even gone as far as stating that if China attacks Taiwan, it will join the US in defending it. According to Japanese Deputy Defense Minister Yasuhide Nakayama, it was important for the world to protect and recognize Taiwan's sovereignty as a democratic country. Tokyo's involvement in the matter is also purposefully looking for a way to limit China's ambitions in the area. What's further infuriating for China is the fact that Japan and Taiwan have begun to work closely economically and militarily. On the south of the Boso Peninsula, near the Chiba Prefecture, the Coast Guard Administration and the Japan Coast Guard jointly conducted a search and rescue drill in the waters. The two sides also practiced ways to share information and collaborate on search and rescue for future events. The show of cooperation is admirable, and the two nations have decided to work together in response to China's increased aggression in the East and South China Seas. Japan has done many things to anger China, but perhaps the most daring of Japan's moves in Taiwan is the sending of its Maritime Self-Defense Force vessel through the Taiwan Strait. This is the first time that Japan has sent any naval ships to the area, and knowing how contentious the area is, this makes sense. The fact that Japan has never participated in these monitoring and scare tactics before is the reason why China's highly suspicious of it now. Anytime that ships move around in this area, it places all of the territories around on high alert. Japan sent its destroyer Sazanami and was joined by Australian and New Zealand vessels as they moved through the waterway between China and Taiwan for some joint military exercises. After this incident, China officially launched a complaint with Japan. China's Foreign Affairs Ministry spokesperson Lin Jian commented on the incident, saying, "China is highly vigilant about the political intentions of Japan's actions and has lodged stern representations with Japan." Thinking strategically, if China wants Japan to butt out of its situation with Taiwan, it needs to give Japan something else to focus on. The speculation is that all the movement around the Japanese airspace in the East China Sea is a warning to Japan that if it interferes, China will not hesitate to invade it. China's hoping that if Japan takes the bait, it will divert its attention to arming itself for war with China instead of meddling. What's making things worse for Japan is the fact that it's getting caught up in the US's involvement in the issue as well. In March of 2021, the Japanese and American Secretaries of Defense released a joint statement. While most nations have been radio silent about China's aggression, the leaders of these two countries began the discussion of Taiwan at a summit in April in Washington, D.C. The joint statement read, "We underscore the importance of peace and stability across the Taiwan Strait and encourage the peaceful resolution of cross-strait issues. We share serious concerns regarding the human rights situations in Hong Kong and the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region. The United States and Japan recognized the importance of candid conversations with China, reiterated their intention to share concerns directly, and acknowledged the need to work with China on areas of common interest." Japanese Prime Minister Yoshihide Suga also went on to release a statement stressing the importance of peace and stability across the Taiwan Strait. China and the United States do not have a good relationship, making it extremely contentious for Japan to be working closely with the White House. The relationship between the two states is already giving China another reason to invade Japan. Outside of their agreement on the Taiwan matter, the United States and Japan have been strengthening their security and military ties. China obviously views the cooperation between the two countries as a threat, and if it wants to affect the balance, it needs to attack one of the two. Japan has become the victim based on its pre-existing issues with China. The US has its own agenda in Taiwan and the Okinawa Islands that China recognizes and is afraid of. The White House's reasoning in assisting Taiwan is largely ideological. Keeping Taiwan independent and free has a lot to do with balancing peace and stability on a global level, and ensuring that no country has more influence than it has to. On a more ambitious level, this is also about making sure China doesn't dominate most of Asia and control a large part of the global economy. China's already shown that it's power-hungry, meaning the more territories it takes, the closer it gets to affecting the US's sovereignty. On a relationship level, Taiwan and the US have a good relationship, which the US is hoping to preserve. On the economic front, Taiwan is an important US trading partner, so protecting its autonomy also has a lot to do with protecting the White House's economic interests. Seeing the multitude of issues that exist between China and Japan, it's infinitely clear why China would want to invade it. Japan understands the situation it's in because it has evidently been preparing for war. In response to the increased aggression from China, Japan is moving to adopt a more aggressive policy in defending itself. Since 2022, Japan has released a lot of policy documents that outline an intention to increase military spending and to develop stronger counterstrike mechanisms. After its embarrassing defeat in World War II, Japan retreated and chose to maintain a military policy that was simply focused on its own self-defense. Not wanting to attract too much attention to itself or to be portrayed as an aggressor, Japan's military policy was focused on building its defenses and monitoring military trends in the world. The problem with this is that while Japan was focused on that, other nations in the Indo-Pacific like China were gearing up to be the aggressors. This means that Japan has a lot of catching up to do if it wants to be in a place where it reaches parity with its competition. In its new policy document, Japan discusses how China's exponential growth as an economic and military powerhouse could mean that it will not be afraid to flex its muscle. The current gap between China's military budget and Japan's is alarming, with Beijing spending 4.5 times more on its defense than Tokyo. And that's just comparing China's official numbers. As we've covered before, China has a habit of understating its military spending by a lot. In preparation for potential conflict, Tokyo has been working hard to increase its budget. It's so far committed to increasing its defense-related spending to 2% of its gross domestic product, or $320 billion in the next 5 years. In order to increase its ability to defend, Japan's cabinet has confirmed Japan's biggest defense budget to date. The plan for 2024 is to increase the budget to a whopping $56 billion. Under Prime Minister Fumio Kishida's government that aims to prepare Tokyo for war with China. Under this plan, Japan is planning to spend $300 billion till 2027, and its annual spending is expected to hit $68 billion. If Japan meets these numbers, it will become the third biggest military spender after the United States and China. In terms of building an arsenal, through its allyship with the US, Japan is planning on acquiring F-35 combat jets and other American weapons for combat. About $5.15 billion from its defense budget is being earmarked for the purchase of Type 12 cruise missiles and US-made Tomahawks. These long-range missiles have been widely used by the US and its allies, achieving great results. On top of the ones it'll be receiving from the US, Japan is also looking to develop its next range of long-range missiles. To fund this project, it will be spending $562 million for the development of hypersonic guided missiles that have an impressive range of 1,864 miles, or 3,000 kilometers. Japan's fast-track approach has been so successful, Defense Minister Minoru Kihara has announced that the deployment of some of the Tomahawks and Type 12s will be pushed a year earlier than expected, to the end of March 2026. Japan is also looking to strengthen its missile defense system, and this is going to take about $8.78 billion from the budget. For its naval pursuits, Japan will be spending $2.62 billion to construct 2 Aegis-equipped warships for deployment between 2027 and 2028. These warships are special and expensive because they will come equipped with Lockheed Martin's Spy-7 radar that has the capacity to locate the most notorious hard-to-detect missiles. This system will even be able to intercept high-arch trajectory missiles and intercontinental ballistic missiles like the ones produced in North Korea with ease. This is not the end of Japan's expenditure. Japan will also be spending $530 million in the joint development of glide phase interceptors with the United States, and this project will be completed by 2030. On top of that, Japan will be spending about $490 million on some fighter jets that it will be working on with Britain and Italy. This project is part of a joint agreement to develop weapons technology that will be handy for production and sales. Japan has also gone ahead and eased its initial ban on the export of lethal weapons. Under the original regulations, it could not export weapons to countries at war, and all of its arms exports required Japan's approval if the country wished to transfer the equipment to another country. The new regulations allow the export of Japanese arms and munitions, meaning that Japan will be able to export its arms to its allies. While working on its internal affairs, Japan realizes that the game of war requires friends too. Externally, Japan has also begun to improve its relationships with other countries so that it has allies if a potential war breaks out. The relationship between the US and Japan proves the saying that the enemy of your enemy is your friend. In the early 2000s, the military cooperation between the two countries increased, and this graph shows that there are more United States military personnel in Japan than anywhere else in the world. There are approximately 55,000 US military personnel stationed in Japan. And the U.S. has also entrusted its prized military assets, the USS Ronald Reagan Carrier Strike Group and the F-35 Joint Strike Fighter, to Tokyo. Japan also acquires more than 90% of its defense imports from the United States, and the two countries have been working well together in the area of technological advancements. Their agreement on arms production shows that the two nations are swiftly working towards ensuring that they're both prepared for the inevitable. In April, during a Washington summit, U.S. President Joe Biden and Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida released a joint statement explaining that they were bumping up U.S.-Japan strategic cooperation, with everything from a project for the co-development of missiles to manned moon landings. As part of their new agreement, Japan's looking to create a joint command structure by 2025 where its military is brought together with South Korea and the U.S. This arrangement will create a unified command where all three countries will work together on air, land, and sea. These are not Japan's only allies, and it's looking to foster a relationship with the Philippines as well. In July, the two nations solidified their ties and signed the Reciprocal Access Agreement. This agreement is meant to relax processes around the entry of equipment and troops for combat training between Manila and Tokyo. The cooperation between the two countries adds to Japan's network of allies, considering the fact that the Philippines is also a U.S. ally. The Philippines and China both recognize the need to work together, considering their interests in stopping China in the South China Sea, the Taiwan Strait, and around the Okinawa Islands. The increase in China's aggression over the past couple of years has been a major cause for concern for most of the international community. As it's increased its economic and military influence, it's also doubled in its ambition. Considering the history that the two countries have, Japan has a lot to be afraid of. China's ambitions in the Okinawa Islands come from a deeply entrenched belief that they belong to China originally and have been stolen from it. Furthermore, Japan's interference in other areas like Taiwan is causing trouble for China, and it may be looking for a way to subdue it. Fortunately, Japan is not sitting idly waiting for China to attack. Japan's new policy and the increase in its military defense planning and spending show that it's preparing for a war, and it'll be ready when one comes.
This is China, the dragon of the East and the world's second largest economy. This is Japan, the land of the rising sun and the world's third largest economy. There is no love lost between these two powerhouses, and it might not be too wild of a statement to say that a brutal war in Asia might be an impending inevitability.
There is the historical threat from China. Both nations have territorial disputes.
Chinese government ships entered the Japanese waters.
By 2027, Japan will have the third largest defense budget in the world.
It's a very strong feeling in China that Japan is the enemy.
China's massive military buildup in the Pacific.
Japan is arming itself like it never has before.
China and Japan have had squabbles and near incidents for years now. But it seems like the time for talk is nearing an end. In what has been a steep departure from its years of pacifism, Japan, at the beginning of this year, announced that it will double its military spending to 2% of GDP in the next 5 years. That is the nation's largest buildup since the Second World War. This action would make Japan the third largest military spender in the world, behind only China and the USA. But what is Japan's reason for this drastic action? Well, China. Or in Japan's own words, China poses the greatest strategic challenge ever. This present moment seems to be the final tipping point in what has been a troubled 1,966 years of hostile coexistence. The big question is, where is this hostility rooted? In this video, I'll seek to explain the combative relationship between Japan and China, the history behind their relationship, what the future holds for these two East Asian powerhouses, and if indeed war is on the horizon. Alright, before we jump into things, be sure to hit that like button below. It helps out a lot against the bots who try to dislike the video to kill its reach. Recently, the channel was mass reported for my coverage about the Russian war, which led to a big hit to the views, so your likes really help out a lot. Thank you. Sakoku is a Japanese term that roughly translates to closed country. In Japan, this word is one of great historical significance. It represents a simpler time, a time of dynastic rule and noble lords, a time when samurai and arquebusiers had little need to defend the land, a time of peace and stability. For 215 years, the Tokugawa shogunate implemented Sakoku. This made Japan an isolationist state, uncorrupted by profane foreign cultures. Until one day, in 1854, when an American Commodore and 1,600 Marines arrived in Yokohama to turn their world upside down. Of course, that's not completely true. Yes, Japan had been a quote-unquote closed country for about 215 years. But before that time, they had plenty of exposure to outside cultures. By the time Commodore Perry turned up in Tokyo, then called Edo, Japan had already built and destroyed close cultural bonds with a wide array of nations. Even so, Sakoku was no joke. During this time, nearly all Japanese commoners were forbidden from leaving the country. Likewise, only a scant few foreign nationals were ever allowed entry. While the Tokugawa shogunate allowed some trade with the Dutch and the Chinese, this was sorely restricted. And yet, despite the shogunate's best efforts, people across Japan took a great interest in what they called Dutch studies, a catch-all term for European engineering, medicine, and military science. The demand for foreign writings eventually grew so great that the government was forced to lift the ban on outside publications in 1716. The shogunate would go on to fully embrace the study of Dutch texts, eventually creating an agency dedicated solely to translating these works for the Japanese public. Remember this, it'll be important later. There was one foreign land the Japanese elites respected above all others. China had culturally influenced the island nation since the year 645, when Emperor Kotoku wrote into law the Taika Reforms, a set of legal codes based around Chinese Confucian philosophy. The reforms, designed to centralize control in the hands of the emperor, were derived from a series of envoys who had been sent to China to study every aspect of their culture. These diplomats became proficient in Chinese writing systems and Chinese literature, studied Chinese diet and architecture. They even scrutinized the manifold religious traditions popular during the Tang Dynasty. These reforms quickly came to dominate Japanese governance and many core aspects of Japanese life. The role of women was restricted in Japan, just as it was in China. The land was reorganized into provinces and counties, just as it was in China, and a top-down system of governance was introduced, with a system of administration and written law that replaced the patchwork of hereditary institutions once endowed with the power of governance. These changes would echo through Japanese history. Fast forward 1,200 years to 1845, and Japanese students are still expected to learn Chinese and study the Chinese literary classics. And while foreigners from China were still restricted to the port of Nagasaki, they were the only nation granted the special privilege of a small residential district within the city. But even considering these special privileges, relations between Japan and China weren't exactly warm. Since the late 1670s, there was an active national learning movement presented within Japanese society. This intellectual crusade took the view that Japanese culture was inherently pure. It decried the overabundance of Chinese academia, advocating for a focus on the history of Japan and the Japanese imperial family. And, at its core, national learning sought the eradication of all so-called corrupting foreign influences. Chief among these foreign influences was, of course, Chinese culture. The movement focused heavily on the Japanese language and the structure of the nation's historical development. Taking a page out of the Neo-Confucianist book, these early Japanese nationals created the Dai Nihon Shi, or in English, the History of Great Japan. This prodigious work of Japanese history and pride, like many products of the national learning movement, was ironically based upon the Chinese model of intellectual nationalism. While the Chinese Empire emphasized the study of Chinese classical literature, the National Learning sect attempted to draw focus towards the poetic works and feudal traditions of ancient Japan. Despite its occasionally derivative nature, the National Learning movement's proponents eventually mounted a full-scale war against all foreign influences. This included an attempt to purge Japan of all Buddhist and Confucian institutions. A lofty task given that the Japanese state was run based on Confucian principles, and each Japanese citizen had to be registered at a Buddhist temple. Certainly, the National Learning movement was not an immediate success, but its core tenets took root during the Tokugawa shogunate and steadily spread. During his reign from 1680 to 1709, Shogun Tokugawa Tsunayoshi made it a policy to encourage national learning among scholars of the era. He and members of his clan actively provided funding for the National Learning Scholarship. In 1728, nativist scholar Karuna Azumamoro established his National Learning Academy in Kyoto, where he emphasized the purity of the Japanese imperial dynasty and discouraged Buddhism and Confucianism as corroding influences, attracting many Shinto clergymen to his way of thinking. By 1746, one of his students, Kamo no Mabuchi, was hired to lecture members of the ruling Tokugawa clan on ancient Japanese history. In 1760, Kamo no Mabuchi became a wandering scholar. He traveled throughout Japan preaching a dualistic ideology, in which Japanese culture, with its more fluid grammatical structure, was representative of all that was good and natural, while Chinese culture, with its strict grammar and more structured writing, was the embodiment of the artificial, unnatural aspects of the human life. In 1765, Kamo no Mabuchi penned his seminal work called The Study of the Idea of Our Country. Published in 1806, decades after his death, the book took aim at the prevalence of Chinese learning, which was so common in Japan. In his text, Kamo managed to encapsulate the core of the national learning philosophy. He argued that Chinese life was comprised of nothing but terror and suffering, owing to the periodic rise and fall of the many imperial dynasties. He juxtaposed this idea with the allegedly more consistent, more stable Japanese dynasty, which national learning scholars so adored. Thus, in this national learning movement, we can see the beginnings of the Japanese nationalism that would come to dominate, a set of ideas that held Japanese superiority, the purity of the unbroken imperial line, and a general distaste for Chinese society and culture at its core. It's February of 1854, and the United States Commodore Matthew C. Perry is sailing into Tokyo Bay for the second time. On his first trip, the Commodore approached the island nation with a fleet of 4 vessels and a letter from President Millard Fillmore requesting a treaty that would establish diplomatic relations and bonds of trade between the two countries. Today, he has returned after half a year, this time with 9 ships in tow. By the end of March, he will have secured the signature of Emperor Komei on the Treaty of Kanagawa. Still favoring its long-time isolationism, the government of Japan was predictably displeased to find itself trapped between a rock and a hard place. Perry's expedition and the ensuing treaty left Japan feeling more vulnerable than ever. Only 12 years before the Kanagawa Treaty was signed, Japan had watched its neighbor to the west fall prey to the military might of the British Empire. The First Opium War was a massive defeat for Imperial China. Despite its wealth and grandeur, the powerful nation had failed to maintain its own sovereignty, losing its right to ban opium imports and finding itself locked into a treaty that gave land, trade power, and significant legal authority over to the British. While Perry's treaty was not nearly as invasive as the one that the Chinese had been forced to sign, it was still viewed as an egregious usurpation of Japanese authority. The 1854 agreement established 2 minor ports where American naval steamships could refuel and stock up on supplies. It also protected American whalers, provided for the humane treatment of shipwrecked American seamen, and established an American consulate in the city of Shimoda. Above all, this meant one thing: Sakoku was dead. Isolation was over. and Japan, whether it liked it or not, was now part of the international community. By 1858, Japan had signed treaties with Britain, Russia, and France, as well as a second treaty with the United States. Altogether, the island nation was now trading with almost every foreign power that expressed interest in doing so. Furthermore, the nation had granted extraterritoriality to many foreign states, preventing the citizens of other nations from facing trial inside of Japan. The swift evaporation of their country's sovereignty left the people of Japan disillusioned and dissatisfied with the leadership of the Tokugawa shogunate. The nativist spark that national learning principles had been coaxing for decades was now ready to ignite. The military movement to overthrow the shogun and restore the imperial family to power began in 1866. The feudal domains in the south and west of Japan had long expressed dissatisfaction with the rule of the shogun. Despite their similar inclinations, they were trapped in a cycle of feuding interests which kept them forever divided. At long last, after the laundry list of unequal treaties had been signed, the clear encroachment of foreign powers forced these regions to unite. They could not have chosen a better time to coalesce. For the people of Japan, after centuries of isolation, were not well disposed towards the mass of outsiders whose trading vessels now gathered in their ports. Their rallying cry was Sono Joi, revere the emperor, expel the barbarians. On November 9, 1867, Tokugawa Yoshinobu willingly gave over his rights and privileges to the emperor. After 10 days, he resigned, and the office of the shogun was no more. The events that followed represent one of the swiftest periods of development in the great saga of human existence. This period is known to history as the Meiji Restoration. In 1867, Japan was a nation in crisis. The regime that had ruled Japanese society for centuries was out of power. The young Emperor Meiji, not yet in his 15th year of life, was now tasked with governing a country of 34 million. And Japan, feudal and underdeveloped, now seemed destined to meet the same fate as its neighbor to the west. And yet, by 1895, their fortunes had reversed. Japan found itself the most technologically developed and industrialized nation in Asia, with a military strong enough to face the very empires that had broken their isolation a mere 41 years ago. How? There are many factors that come together to explain the seemingly miraculous rise of the Japanese Empire. But before we discuss what Japan managed to achieve in its rapid rise to the top, we should identify the groundwork that made it possible. Despite its regressive political structure and intense isolation, Japan was a shockingly well-educated society. Samurai, the Japanese warrior class, quickly turned towards bureaucracy to make themselves useful during the country's 2 centuries of peace. These warriors and their children became local government officials, tasked with keeping records and enforcing the law. To give their samurai the necessary administrative skills, many daimyo, Japanese feudal lords, opened schools to educate their loyal retainers. Additionally, many of the common folk had money enough to send their children to Terakoya, a type of private school that taught basic reading and writing skills. Their population was also vastly more urbanized than one would expect for a nation whose economy was based largely on agriculture. This urbanization likely also owes its existence to the surplus wealth generated by avoiding violent conflict. With such a heavily literate population, it's no wonder fields like Dutch studies became so prominent in Japan. Though they did not immediately act on the knowledge they consumed, members of Japanese society were still uncommonly well-informed on matters concerning the more developed portion of the globe. While their physical infrastructure lagged far behind Europe and the United States, the shogunate's governance may have actually managed to build a feudal population more inclined towards rapid reform and development than any other in the course of human history. With this ready foundation, Japan began its rise in 1868. When a council made up of military leaders who restored the emperor to power was formed. Most of these state councilors were ambitious young men from the lower rungs of the samurai, but what they lacked in experience, they made up for in skillful planning. The old feudal domains were abolished and replaced with the system of prefectures that is still used today. The old class of feudal lords gave up their land and power to become kazoku, noble peers of the realm, with seats in a chamber of parliament modeled after the British House of Lords. The samurai class was also abolished, and these warrior families became shizoku, a class between the commoners and nobility with no special privileges beyond a modest imperial stipend. In 1872, the local militias of noble houses were abolished and replaced by a unified standing military, organized in the style of the great imperial powers of the age. A new system of conscription mandated 3 years of military service from all men of all classes. A unified command office was created in 1878 to coordinate naval and army actions. These joint chiefs of staff answered directly to the emperor and were given broad authority in matters of military planning. The spirit of loyalty and obedience that had once been the province of the samurai came to define the new, drastically enlarged military class. Young men throughout Japan were transformed during their mandatory service. And when they went home, they carried the ideals of the armed forces and the old samurai's Bushido code back with them. The military found profound success, both as a defensive force and as a method of social transformation. The Japanese economy saw similar modernization. By 1880, all major cities were connected by telegraph lines. In 1882, a modern banking system was established in Japan and was paired with government programs to fund private industry. By 1872, Japan's first railway was constructed. By 1890, more than 2,000 kilometers of track had been laid. Japanese imports increased by $435 million. Exports increased by $395 million, an average increase above 400% in just 34 years. Needless to say, industrialization was achieved. As Japan modernized and embraced its imperial vision, its eyes turned toward mainland East Asia. Korea had been a tributary state of Imperial China since the mid-4th century. But China had never exercised complete control over the country. Korea's tributary status was often ceremonial in nature, leaving the peninsula with control over domestic affairs while they ceded authority over international matters to the dynasties of Imperial China. But by the mid-19th century, China was in dire straits, having lost much of its own autonomy in the Opium Wars. Japan, on the other hand, was rising in the east and ready for imperial expansion. Now, Korea was a strategically important location for both China and Japan. The peninsula was a buffer zone between the two nations and would be supremely relevant in any conflict between the two states because of its potential to dramatically shorten supply lines. Instead of crossing the entire China Sea, the Japanese would only need to cross the much shorter Yellow Sea if a conflict arose. And for Japan, the economic potential of the Korean peninsula was too great to ignore. While Japan is comparatively lacking in natural resources, Korea is rich in iron and coal reserves. For a nation so eager to expand, the opportunity to improve military readiness was too great to ignore. As Japan, the rising star of the East, grew even stronger and China's dominance began to fade, conflict in Korea became inevitable. On September 20th, 1875, a group of Japanese sailors went ashore on Ganghwa Island in Korea's coastal waters. The men, sent to request water and supplies, sparked a violent response from the local Korean military installations. The island's forts fired on the sailors' vessel. The Japanese ship, called the Un-Yo, responded with exceptional force. First by bombarding the island's military fortifications, then by landing on the island to set the locals' homes ablaze. In the end, the Koreans were left with 35 dead, 16 captured, and 1 fort destroyed, all by a force of 22 Japanese sailors. 5 months and 6 days later, the Treaty of Ganghwa Island was signed. The agreement was not unlike the Treaty of Kanagawa, but this time Japan was the aggressor. Its provisions officially ended Korea's tributary relationship with China, opened 3 Korean ports to trade with Japan, and granted Japanese citizens extraterritoriality within Korea's borders. For the next 8 years, China and Japan jockeyed for influence over the Korean people. While Japanese leaders supported Korean modernization efforts and defended reformers, China threw its lot in with conservative traditionalists, including the Korean monarchy. Tensions came to a head in 1884 when the Japan-backed Enlightenment Party of Korea attempted a coup d'etat against the China-backed monarchy. While the coup was a failure, it did result in a mutual agreement between China and Japan to withdraw all their troops from Korea. This brings us to the tipping point, the first great conflict in the modern era between Qing Dynasty China and the Empire of Japan, the First Sino-Japanese War. For a period of 10 years after the attempted coup, tensions had a chance to cool. That all changed in 1894, when Kim Ok-kyun, the pro-Japanese Korean leader of the failed uprising, was lured to Shanghai and murdered by Chinese forces. His body was taken back to Korea aboard a Chinese warship. There, his dismembered corpse was put on display in public as a warning to the pro-Japanese rebels. Unsurprisingly, the people of Japan saw this grotesque display as an inexcusable assault on Japanese national pride. China had just butchered a man whose entire life was dedicated to taking Korea down the same path of modernization that Japan was undertaking. Later that year, after the breakout of a peasant rebellion in Korea, Chinese officials sent troops over the border to help defuse the rebels. Already on edge, Japan saw this as a violation of their previous agreement to keep troops off the peninsula. Soon enough, 8,000 Japanese soldiers were marching on Korean soil to combat the 2,900 sent by China. Quickly, the rebels began to lay down their arms, encouraging all foreign warriors to leave the peninsula. The Korean king was similarly inclined and ordered all Chinese troops to leave his country in hopes this would mollify the Japanese. These efforts backfired. With a large military force on the ground and no Chinese soldiers to stop them, Japan marched into Seoul. They quickly captured the king and gave him the title of Emperor to signify Korea's final and complete detachment from Imperial China. After this, China sent over 11,000 elite soldiers, the best troops they had to offer, aboard the Kaohsiung. But as the ship sailed across the Yellow Sea, it was destroyed by the Japanese Navy. As the ship and the soldiers sank, so too did the hopes of the Chinese people. Since the end of the Opium Wars, Imperial China had attempted to renovate its military, doing its best to modernize in the way Japan had. Their inferior weapons and tactics showed that their efforts had all been for naught. War was not declared until August 1st, 1894. While the international community predicted China, with its vastly larger army, would attain an easy victory, the reality of Japanese modernization soon set in. The vastly superior Japanese forces were able to slash through the poorly funded Chinese Navy and eviscerate the enemy nation's supply lines. After this, they cut off Chinese forces in northern Korea and encircled Pyongyang. On September 15th, Prince Yamagata Aritomo led Japanese armed forces as they converged on Pyongyang. The prince's 10,000 troops did battle with the 14,000 Chinese soldiers in and around the city. By the end of the day, 6,000 Chinese troops lay dead, missing, or injured, with only 568 casualties on the Japanese side. Overwhelmed, the Chinese left the city, falling back behind the border in hopes of defending the homeland. Little did they know, these efforts would also be in vain. Japanese forces managed to invade Manchuria, north of Beijing, and the province of Shandong, to the south of Beijing. They proceeded to fortify their control of all naval routes into the capital city. Quickly, the Japanese Navy and Army, from land and sea, managed to seize control of Port Arthur, a port city on a tiny peninsula between Korea and northeast China. It was there, on November 21st, 1894, that Japanese armed forces perpetrated the first in a long line of large-scale war crimes on Chinese soil. The massacre came after the discovery of several injured Japanese soldiers, men no longer fit for combat, who had been physically mutilated, burned, and killed by Chinese soldiers and bounty hunters. There is documentation of many Japanese troops, including Lieutenant Kijiro Nanbu, pledging to seek vengeance for what was done to their injured comrades. Though the city had been evacuated, there were still thousands of civilians remaining in Port Arthur when Japanese troops entered the city around 2 p.m. Multiple reports of the events that transpired were set down in writing by Japanese soldiers. When the slaughter was done, an unknown number of corpses were left to rot. Within the city, at least 2,600 were killed, but the majority of the deaths occurred in the suburban hills surrounding Port Arthur. The massacre's total death count could be as high as 20,000. Upon seeing that their capital city was under threat from the north, south, and east, the Chinese sued for peace. What followed was the Treaty of Shimonoseki, signed in April of 1895. In this document, China recognized an independent Korea and made substantial territorial concessions. China gave up Taiwan and the 64 smaller surrounding islands that made up the Pescadores archipelago. They even stooped so low as to give away the Liaodong Peninsula, the landmass upon which Port Arthur sat. In addition to the land concessions, China was expected to give Japan 17.6 million pounds of silver as war reparations, and granted Japan trading privileges within Chinese territory. The defeat China suffered was so severe that European nations saw additional opportunity to encroach on Chinese authority, causing a cascade effect that would trigger several revolutionary movements that would eventually see China's Qing dynasty removed from power. China's Qing dynasty came to power in the mid-1600s. For centuries, the regime faced violent conflict and rebellion from within their own borders. The ethnically Manchurian royal family encountered frequent conflicts with the majority Han Chinese population and a variety of secret societies, religious sects, and ethnic minorities that existed inside their vast land empire. By the mid-1800s, the Opium Wars, severe corruption, poorly managed military affairs, and cascading natural disasters resulted in widespread famine, killing some 40 million. Needless to say, the Qing dynasty was already primed for a total collapse, when, in 1850, a failed civil service student named Hong Qichuan started a rebellion by claiming to be the younger brother of Jesus Christ. For the next 14 years, he and his army of followers, mostly starving peasants from Guangxi province, led the most successful rebellion that the Qing dynasty had ever faced. By the end of the rebellion in 1864, as many as 30 million people had died in the conflict. It was then that the Qing knew they f***ed up. Seeing a path to power, radical reformers rallied around the 5-year-old emperor Tongzhou in 1861. China's first ever foreign affairs office was founded, alongside state-funded schools teaching English and French. By 1865, the child emperor's government was manufacturing arms, and the nation's first naval blockade was constructed in 1866. A new naval fleet was commissioned and became the 8th largest in the world. In 1872, Chinese students were sent west to study in American universities and brought valuable knowledge home when they returned. And after using their modern weapons to finally defeat several ongoing rebellions, it looked like the Qing dynasty might actually save itself from utter defeat. However, even as the government tried to change, a series of conservative forces held China back. While the study of modern science and technology was promoted, many young people had little faith in the new path being offered. Study of Confucian classics and passage of the standardized civil service exam was the only reliable route for those wishing to advance their own careers. The things taught in American and European universities were seen as valuable to the nation, but earned Chinese students little respect and even less job security. And though China had purchased a new fleet of ships from all across Europe, its navy was still clumsily managed. Their naval forces were essentially broken up into 4 separate fleets, each functioning in its own region with little to no coordination. The partially modernized army suffered from a similar lack of centralized leadership. Troops were often conscripted and trained at the local level, leaving China's army broken up into several smaller fighting forces, each led by a different high-ranking imperial official. In 1873, the 17-year-old Emperor Tongzhi was put in direct control of the government, despite his age. This move showcased a core flaw in the Qing dynasty's modernization movement, namely their complete unwillingness to emulate new modes of governance. Without the more consultative, merit-based forms of government that dominated more powerful nations, China struggled to construct a resilient society. Rampant corruption and institutional malaise proved too great a challenge, even for the most ardent reformers. Needless to say, the self-strengthening movement was a failure. Except the Tongzhi reforms weren't Imperial China's only attempt at reform. After Tongzhi's death in 1875, the Guangxi Emperor ascended to the throne. And while he spent his first 24 years in the office only nominally ruling while his aunt, the Dowager Empress Cixi, governed, he did have a brief 9-year window of power beginning in 1889. Following China's embarrassing defeat in the Sino-Japanese War, a panoply of groups across the country began advocating for modernization. Intellectuals across China began to publish works arguing for various paths to reform. And in 1898, during his aunt's semi-retirement, the Guangxu Emperor began to accede to the requests of certain moderate reformers. On the 11th of June, the emperor issued his first reform decree in which he asked the people of China to study foreign subjects like medicine and engineering. Shortly after, the emperor began to speed up reforms, moderating himself less and less. In total, 40 separate imperial commands aimed at modernization were written into law. The Confucian civil service was to be dismantled and replaced with a national system of universities and lower secondary and primary schools. Modernized systems of commerce, medical education, and scientific research were adopted. Advanced industry was promoted. The nation's law codes, the civil administration, and the military were all reworked to emulate European, Japanese, and American systems of organization. Though inspiring, the emperor's reforms didn't last. The very same year they were written into law, in 1898, the old guard of Imperial China began to chafe under Guangxu's reforms. Corrupt military leaders, local governors, and Confucian civil administrators felt power slipping through their fingers. These forces quickly rallied around the more conservative Dowager Empress Cixi. Forced out of retirement, the Dowager carried out a coup d'etat and restored herself to power. Though 2 important imperial advisors escaped to Japan, at least 6 of the emperor's reform-oriented staff were executed. Guangxu was imprisoned in his palace, rather than being killed. The people of China, left frustrated with government inertia and despondent over the barrage of foreign attacks, found hope in a wide array of political movements and secret societies. Chief among them was, and I'm not joking, the Society for Righteous and Harmonious Fists, more commonly known as the Boxer Movement. The Boxers were a complex group with a fascinating array of beliefs. But at their core, the movement had one goal: to rid China of all they considered foreign influence. The movement began in the 1890s in northern China, and originally was dedicated to overthrow the Qing dynasty. However, as time passed and their membership rosters expanded, the Boxers grew increasingly focused on the foreign powers that had come to dominate key spheres within Chinese society. The Boxers were most prevalent in Shandong province, just south of the capital Beijing. In this province, poverty had grown relentlessly after years of war, drought, and famine. To make matters worse, unemployed youth turned to banditry en masse to survive, worsening conditions in the region. Chinese Christian converts became a lightning rod for peasant resentment. The faith became a shield for many bandits because of its official protection under imperial law, owing to various treaties signed with European powers. Many converts were able to avoid punishment with impunity. Meanwhile, in Beijing, Dowager Empress Cixi was looking for a way to combat foreign influence. Despite their anti-Qing origins, imperial conservatives largely saw the Boxers as a useful tool to combat foreign powers. After a brief skirmish between the 2 factions, agents of Cixi convinced the group to abandon their opposition to her government and instead support the Qing in destroying the foreigners. After this, the governor of Shandong began to employ Boxer bands as local militias. In late 1899, Boxer gangs began openly assaulting Christian missionaries and their local Chinese followers. These Boxer forces began to march north, distributing anti-Christian propaganda to local peasants. As the march went on, the Boxers burned foreign-built buildings, tore down churches, and slaughtered groups of foreigners and predominantly Chinese Christians. In May of 1900, the Boxers had come to surround the rural areas near Beijing. The city of Beijing housed a population of over 1 million, with a significant number of foreigners in the International Legations Quarter. The legation's fearful residents and the actual diplomats who lived there began to contact their nations for help. In June of 1900, the foreign powers responded to the Boxer mobs with an 8-nation alliance. A force of 2,100 Marines and sailors began to journey towards Beijing. Before they could arrive, thousands of Boxers flooded the city of Beijing and began a mass killing of Chinese Christians. A population of 3,000 Chinese civilians found refuge within the walls of the legation's quarter. On June 11th, Japanese ambassador Sugiyami Akira was assassinated by Boxer troops when he tried to leave the city to meet the incoming relief force. On the 17th of June, a second legion of the Eight-Nation Alliance seized control of the coastal Daegu forts. The next day, Dowager Empress Cixi ordered the indiscriminate killing of all foreigners within the country. The terrified residents of the legation's quarter found themselves besieged. Having received word of the Boxer Rebellion, the Eight-Nation Alliance swiftly assembled a force of 19,000 troops, more than 40% of which came from Japan. On the 14th of August, the massive force took control of Beijing, ending the 8-week-long siege of the legation quarter. After much negotiation, in September of 1901, the Boxer Protocol was signed, mandating $330 million in reparations be paid to the Eight-Nation Alliance, an indemnity far smaller than what the Japanese initially requested. Despite initial Japanese opposition, American diplomats persuaded the alliance to abstain from seizing larger pieces of Chinese territory. Instead, they were convinced to embrace the open door policy, concocted by U.S. Secretary of State John Hay, which mandated Qing territorial integrity be protected, leaving China open to equal investing and trade with all powers. From 1904 to 1905, the people of Japan fought and won a war with the Russian Empire. The historic victory showcased the extent of Japanese power in East Asia. The war saw Manchuria, the enormous northern homeland of the Qing, placed under Japanese control. What's more, after losses to European powers following the First Sino-Japanese War, Japan had successfully regained control of the Liaodong Peninsula, where the city of Port Arthur sat. And perhaps the greatest prize of all, Korea was now firmly under Japanese control. Unsatisfied with the open-door policy, from 1905 to 1907, Japan sought greater territorial control in China. Having taken control of Taiwan in 1895, the Japanese Empire saw the nearby province of Fujian as the ideal place for expansion. However, at this time they were also trying to obtain loans from France, which supported the open-door policy. The French, fearful of territorial conflict, bound Japan to the policy as a condition of their financial agreement. In 1907, the Japanese forced the abdication of Gojong, the Korean monarch. After his departure, the monarchy was removed from power and an extensive campaign of Japanese domination began in the country. In 1910, Japan officially annexed Korea, beginning a manifold effort to forcibly integrate Korea with Japan. A web of Japanese military forces, business interests, and Meiji-era officials seized control of the education system, the police, land ownership, and other key aspects of Korean life. Japanese settlers and businesses interested in agriculture were given land that had been seized from Korean peasants. Those same peasants were forced to perform days of compulsory labor and paid exorbitant taxes to fund large-scale irrigation projects. In schools, Korean language and history were suppressed, while the Japanese language was promoted. These abuses would continue in Korea for the next 35 years. Perhaps chastened by the disastrous Boxer Rebellion, Qing officials seemed to experience a brief period of lucidity. From 1901 to 1911, Cixi and the imperial court implemented several last-ditch reforms attempting, once again, to modernize their country. In 1901, the administrative office was established with a board of 5 well-respected statesmen responsible for overseeing all reforms. The office resolved to institute political reforms that would transform China into a constitutional monarchy over the course of 12 years. In 1906, the process began, and by 1909, China was holding actual parliamentary elections and elections for regional provincial assemblies. From 1902 to 1907, provincial administration was partially reformed. These changes saw the financial and military power of local governors dramatically reduced and modern policing practices established. In 1901, an Office of Foreign Affairs was formed. In 1905, the imperial examination system of the Confucian Classics was abolished, and modernized academics were established in every province to replace it. Tax collection was largely standardized across the country, and new, simplified law codes were established. Reforms made to the military were of similar significance. 1901 saw the founding of a new training system for Imperial Army and naval officers, as well as the establishment of 3 well-stocked arsenals in major cities. In 1903, military readiness was partially addressed with the creation of the Central Training Command. The largest regional army, based in Beiyang, was turned into the new National Army. A lengthy plan to reorganize the army was published in 1904. The report included plans to increase pay, thereby reducing corruption amongst the enlisted men, as well as plans to observe provincial officials to ensure central decrees were enforced at the local level, and plans to assign non-commissioned officer positions to literate soldiers with sufficient expertise. But just as these new directives were implemented, a movement was brewing. Millions of Chinese citizens throughout America, Malaysia, Hong Kong, and other nations began to organize. In 1894, a Chinese-born resident of Hawaii named Sun Yat-sen founded the Revive China Society. The organization, largely populated with Chinese expatriates, was dedicated to fomenting revolution against the Qing. Having received substantial donations from supporters, Sun returned to his homeland, intent on sparking an uprising. His plot failed miserably, and the revolutionary went into exile. But by 1897, Sun had attained great notoriety as the face of Chinese revolution. That year, he moved to Japan and forged close bonds with supporters of the Pan-Asianism movement. In addition to asylum, he eventually began receiving political and financial backing from the Japanese. With the covert support of a powerful nation, Sun Yat-sen's influence began to grow. In 1898, popular Chinese reformist Liang Qichao fled to Japan and established a Chinese publishing outlet. Liang's propaganda, which argued for revolution, was an enormous success. Using Japan as their base of operations, Sun and Liang began to win converts at an exponential rate. In Tokyo in 1905, Sun became the head of the United League, a revolutionary coalition. With chapters across America, Japan, and Europe, the group was particularly attractive to Chinese students studying abroad, making their membership unusually well-educated. But after supporting 12 failed revolts in mainland China, Sun and other revolutionaries began to feel the heat of Qing oppression, even from their hiding places abroad. In 1907, the Japanese government pulled their support for Sun and asked him to leave the country. Unbowed, Sun used his celebrity to fuel a tour across Europe and the United States. As the Qing declined and the propaganda continued to flow, the cause of revolution gained increasing support. In October of 1911, in southern China, the movement for revolution finally caught fire. The Qing, unable to contain the spread, began negotiating for a constitutional monarchy. However, even this concession could not stop the numerous provinces from declaring their support for Sun Yat-sen's revolutionary coalition. Sun quickly left the United States and headed for Europe, where he ensured neither the British nor the French would give aid to the failing Qing. This latest attempt at revolution was indeed a great success, and liberal reformers began the work of establishing a Chinese republic. The new government based itself in Nanjing. Though initially elected as provisional president by the National Assembly, Sun Yat-sen resigned the office, giving it up to Yuan Shikai, the most powerful military leader of the Qing forces, in exchange for an alliance to secure the new republic. However, despite their rapid rise, the new Republic of China was not as secure as many assumed. President Yuan largely ruled using military force alone, and ignored the provisional constitution that the National Assembly put in place. Dissatisfied with his leadership, provinces began to declare independence. Warlord states sprung up, and chaos began to spread. When thinking of the First World War, most minds reasonably turn to Europe. But the Asian sphere, though less central to the conflict itself, was still the backdrop for a massive expansion of Japanese influence over China. In 1914, when the war broke out, Japan saw a great opportunity. Having signed a treaty with the British Empire in 1902, the Japanese were well placed to join the Allies and fight the Germans in the Pacific. Since 1898, Germany had controlled the city of Qingdao in Shandong province. A joint Anglo-Japanese force, led by Japan, lay siege to the German-controlled region. By November of 1914, the Germans had surrendered, leaving much of Shandong in Japanese hands. The events that followed are known to history as the 21 Demands, a Japanese attempt to diplomatically strong-arm China into granting the Pacific Empire many of the special privileges that European powers already enjoyed in the country. The demands were wide-ranging, Some were aggressive but nevertheless expected requests like extended control over Port Arthur, Manchuria, and Shandong, or guarantees of Japanese railroad and mining interests in the country. Other demands, however, were far more extreme. For example, Sections 5 and 6 of the demands would have given Japan power over matters of taxation, government financing, state decision-making, and internal policing, all of which would arguably make China a Japanese protectorate. Enraged and dumbfounded, Chinese President Yuan Shikai rejected the initial demands. The Japanese returned to the negotiating table with a simplified list of only 13 demands, the more egregious requests having been omitted. Tacked onto the new demands was the ultimatum giving the Chinese only 2 days to respond. Yuan Shikai capitulated to Japanese demands and signed the various agreements into law on the 25th of May, 1915. In China, domestic resentment towards the deal with Japan and the Treaty of Versailles was explosive. The issue became known as the Shandong Question and served as a lightning rod for a new sense of Chinese nationalism. This sense of national outrage mixed with national identity was, in no small part, dependent upon a certain anti-Japanese sentiment. One could argue that this event, more than any other, is responsible for the birth of a new, far more aggressive variety of Chinese nationalism. Since the end of their war with Russia, Japan had exercised a hefty degree of control over Manchuria. However, this control came from their support of a man named Zhang Zuolin, the region's powerful warlord. But in 1928, the overconfident Zhang angered his Japanese overlords and found himself on the wrong end of an assassin's pistol. His successor caused similar offense when he explicitly aligned himself with the Republic of China. So, in September of 1931, the Japanese army staged a fake Chinese attack on the South Manchurian Railway, which Japan controlled. The quote-unquote attack was nothing more than a pithy explosion which caused zero damage. Nevertheless, it served as sufficient pretext for invasion. The Japanese army easily took control of the city of Mukden before mounting a full-scale invasion of Manchuria only 3 days later. The Republic of China ordered its troops to withdraw from the region, leaving Manchuria firmly under Japanese control. In the end, China lost some 500 soldiers, the Japanese only lost 2. The empire installed a superficial puppet government headed by the previously abdicated Chinese Emperor Puyi and named this new country Manchukuo. Using the landmass as a base of operations, the Japanese proceeded to interfere in the region known as Inner Mongolia. Here, starting in 1935, well-organized imperial army soldiers pushed out Chinese forces with only light resistance, allowing the Japanese a significant measure of unofficial control over the region. In 1937, 6 years after the Mukden incident, Japanese forces clashed with Chinese troops at the Marco Polo Bridge, frighteningly close to Beijing. This marked a turning point. The conflict in the far north of China had spread to the most populous regions of the country. Since Mukden, an even greater wave of nationalism had spread through Chinese society. Despite their nearly irreconcilable differences, the factions and the warlords were suddenly united in their mission to oppose Japan with all they had. But this newly found unity of purpose did not instantly translate into defensive capacity. For the first 2 years of this new war, the Japanese army found remarkable success. The empire's forces seized major cities and provincial capitals, going as far west as Hankow. They seized control of the majority of ports and dominated the rail network throughout most of the country. After a 3-month-long siege, Chinese forces lost Shanghai in November of 1937 and were forced to flee the area. But the greatest loss in this second Sino-Japanese war was yet to come. In December, after chasing the fleeing Chinese soldiers for more than 200 miles, Japanese troops seized control of the nationalist capital, Nanjing. Outraged and humiliated by the lengthy siege of Shanghai, the Japanese forces were once again hungry for revenge. What followed over the course of the next 6 weeks is known as the Nanjing Massacre, or more commonly, of Nanjing. Prince Yasuhiko Asaka, the emperor's uncle and leader of the Japanese forces, ordered his troops to kill all the captives that Japan had taken prisoner. The criminal directive was followed, and 90,000 unarmed prisoners of war were put to death. Not satisfied with the scale of their first atrocity, the Japanese soldiers went on to murder every military-aged male they could find in Nanjing. In the end, at least 260,000 civilians were murdered, well over half the population of Nanjing. But this number does not include the 90,000 soldiers who were killed after surrender, which would raise the count to 350,000. The crimes against humanity did not stop at murder. At least 20,000 and as many as 80,000 women were raped by gangs of Japanese soldiers. The victims were assaulted by 10 or 20 men at a time, only to be murdered in the aftermath. Troops raided businesses and private homes under the guise of collecting food, destroying shop fronts and breaking down doors to loot and pillage. A Nazi trade representative named John Rabe was living in the city at the time. Despite his party affiliation, Rabe was disgusted by what he saw taking place. Under his leadership, a small coalition of about 24 foreigners who had not fled the city established the 2.5 square mile Nanjing safety zone. There, some 250,000 civilians hid, though they were subject to frequent raids by the Japanese military. After Nanjing's virtual destruction, the westward city of Hankou became the new capital. But the city's new status could not protect it from falling into Japanese hands in October of 1938, along with the city of Canton. Imperial forces then swept across the lower Yangtze Valley, taking control of all rail lines therein. And Japan's naval forces continued to dominate the sea. But Japan's good fortune soon ran thin. Chiang Kai-shek, leader of the Chinese Nationalist Forces, soon moved his capital to a more defensible position west of the Yangtze Gorges. Many of the nation's most prominent leaders regrouped with Chiang across the western provinces of Sichuan and Yunnan. There, they dug in for the long haul, still in control of about half of Chinese territory. Their defensive positions proved favorable, and they managed to frustrate the Japanese advance. Meanwhile, throughout occupied territory, Japan struggled to attain the cooperation of the resentful Chinese citizenry. Few Chinese civilians were willing to work with their new imperial overlords. Many thought collaboration to be shameful. Many others feared retribution from the underground militant operatives who served the loyalist cause. And while Japanese forces maintained control over cities and railways, they found significant opposition across the more rural swaths of their territory. There, guerrilla mobs loyal to an independent China were able to maintain informal control for years at a time. Though most guerrillas were originally servants of the nationalist cause, those affiliated with the communist faction often proved more effective thanks to their prior experience fighting Chiang's forces. Skilled in their covert operations, the Reds began sending their troops behind enemy lines. There they made common cause with rural villagers who, regardless of their previous party affiliation, were now willing to work with any group opposing the Japanese. In many cases, these communist operatives managed to transform small agricultural communities into well-organized self-defense units with secret local governments run by party members. Of course, these operatives also actively spread communist propaganda, and perhaps because of their intimate grassroots approach, the Communist Party began to expand exponentially. The Reds' largest fighting force was called the 8th Route Army. This particular portion of the guerrilla insurgency saw its rosters balloon with shocking speed, going from 30,000 troops in 1937 to 156,000 in 1938. 8th Route was ostensibly folded into the larger Nationalist Army in 1938, but in reality remained under communist control, operating independently in the mountains and plains of northern China. Meanwhile, the lesser communist force known as the New 4th Army was charged with taking action in the lower Yangtze Valley. This trend of communist expansion would continue on throughout the war. Back in 1936, in the district of Pingfan in east-central Manchuria, a special detachment of the Japanese Imperial Army was established. Its name was Unit 731. The unit's innocuous title served to cover its insidious mission. The detachment and its 3,607 workers were tasked with a special kind of scientific investigation, the likes of which displayed such depravity that their labors are now synonymous with the acts of Dr. Joseph Mengele. Unit 731 researched and developed both chemical and biological weapons. Under the leadership of Japanese Surgeon General Shiro Ishii, the facility's personnel carried out some of the most egregious acts of torture and human experimentation ever seen in history. Chinese conscript laborers were brought on to construct Pingfan. Many of these workers froze to death during the winter chills. Others were dealt with in mass executions after their work was done. The secrets of the facility would be protected at all costs. In their Manchurian base of operations, the Japanese scientists referred to their human subjects as logs, in keeping with the facility's official cover as a lumber mill. Just as in Hitler's death camps, the victims were given a number to replace their name. Likewise, the research campus at Pingfan was equipped with 3 massive crematoriums in which the vast uncounted dead were disposed of, their ashes leaving behind no remains for future generations to find. Despite official rules about who was to be experimented upon, in actual practice there were no limits. Criminals and communist prisoners of war sat beside pregnant mothers and infant children in Pingfan's cells. These people were delivered in trucks and railroad freight cars, often hidden beneath actual logs being brought to the camp. After arrival, the true work of Pingfan would begin. Prisoners were infected with a wide range of communicable diseases, including typhoid, typhus, tularemia, anthrax, syphilis, cholera, tuberculosis, botulism, and any other viral or bacterial infections the physicians at Pingfan wanted to study. Unit 731 workers had a special affinity for the bubonic plague, often throwing prisoners into pits filled with rats and fleas contaminated with the disease. For those imprisoned at Pingfan, death was the most pleasant outcome. The victims' suffering did not end so long as their heart remained beating in their chest. Those who survived one round of experimentation were infected again and again to test the efficacy of certain inoculations. Some had blood repeatedly drawn from their bodies to test how long they could survive with ever fewer ounces of the vital fluid. Some were used to study the effects of frostbite on the human body. They were taken out into the woods in mid-December and forced to stand in ice water until their limbs were frozen. The more resilient test subjects suffered through every malady known to man: necrotic rot, lymphatic inflammation, crippling fever, ulcers, buboes and boils, but above all, pain, debilitation, blinding, undiluted physical pain for months on end. The finale of each patient's time in the facility brought greater suffering still, as many of them were vivisected, a practice in which people are dissected while still alive. These victims were rarely given anesthetic to ease their suffering, because the scientists wanted to avoid tainting test results. Vital organs were regularly removed from the inmates whenever researchers required, say, a liver or an eye to examine. These people were often sewn back up and left to die without any form of treatment. Running out of research subjects was, after all, never a concern. The cities and villages throughout Japanese-occupied territory provided plenty of unfortunates, desperate enough to be lured into Pingfan with a promise of food or extra employment. What's more, Unit 731 did not work alone. While Pingfan was the largest research facility, it was only one of several dozen such institutions throughout Japanese-controlled lands. Japanese Surgeon General Shiro Ishii turned his methods of human experimentation into a vast network, which featured somewhat prominently in Japanese medical circles. And yet, despite acquiring a veneer of prestige, Ishii's networks of military researchers consistently violated the most fundamental ethical principles of medical practice. Each center was charged with investigating the effects of biochemical weapons on living people. Each did so without regard for basic human rights and dignity. Each saw untold thousands tortured until death. In October of 1940, a single airplane flew over Kaimingji. What at first was feared to be another bomber turned out to be something far stranger. From the air, the pilot dropped grain in vast quantities on the hungry population below. What followed was a scene more reminiscent of medieval Europe than 20th century China. Bubonic plague spread from the deposited fleas and food to the bodies of Kaimingji's civilian population. Within days, hundreds of cases sprung up. The outbreak went on for 2 full months before Chinese authorities could take any real action to stop the spread. Officials eventually evacuated the infected area and built a 14-foot wall around the quarantine zone. The Chinese covered the place in sulfur and burned the entire section of the city to eradicate the disease. This one event was only the first in a long line of experimental biological warfare attacks overseen by Shiroishi. At least 11 separate Chinese cities were attacked, often with ceramic explosives designed to detonate with minimal firepower so as to not damage the disease-infested cargo they carried. 12 separate attacks, all targeting civilians, were deployed. Some aimed to infect people by handing out bread and sweets contaminated with paratyphoid. Others tried to devastate crops with pernicious pests. And on several occasions, the Japanese troops were sent to poison life-giving sources of water. In 1941, bubonic plague was introduced to the city of Chengdi, a major population center. Once again, a single aircraft was deployed over the city, dropping food and other infected biomatter. In this attack, many thousands of people became infected at an alarming rate, hamstringing the nationalist government's response and causing widespread chaos. By early 1939, things had reached a freezing point. The nationalists held down the fort in the west, the guerrillas kept the Japanese army occupied, and Japan attempted to strangle Chinese supply lines. The Imperial Navy proved itself largely capable of blocking Chinese attempts to resupply on the vast eastern coast. While a few ports were only under intermittent Japanese occupation, the empire still managed to dominate this part of the country with only some difficulty. But the situation shifted in September of 1939 when Japan's ally, Germany, invaded Poland, kicking off World War II. Though deadlocked in China, the Empire of Japan encountered a golden opportunity on June 14, 1939, when Nazi troops marched into Paris and seized control of France. The fall of the French metropole left their colony, Indochina, modern-day Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam, up for grabs. In 1940, they went south to occupy the former French territory and seized control of the last coastal rail line leading into southern China. But much to Japan's chagrin, alliances shifted and eventually the British began using their colony in Myanmar to sustain the Chinese. Japan then countered Britain's move in 1942 when they took control of Myanmar and the British colony of Hong Kong, once again cutting off supply lines into free China. Chiang and the allied Chinese forces were left in dire straits. Back in 1941, the cooperation between the communists and the nationalists had begun to break down. The Reds' numbers had continued to grow despite taking serious losses. In 1940, the 8th Route Army's ranks swelled to 400,000. Unwilling to obey Chiang Kai-shek's orders to evacuate their troops from certain regions, communist forces had found themselves, once again, in violent conflict with the nationalists. These conflicts ended in a real collaboration between the two major parties in China's quote-unquote united front. The slow and rickety path to nationalist China's eventual encirclement left the country weak and desperate. Having lost all their major manufacturing hubs in the east, they were often unable to maintain the modernized standards they had come to embrace after the revolution. Without advanced manufacturing and access to transportation infrastructure, the nationalist government was unable to support its troops, much less the mass of civilian refugees that had fled into their territory from the occupied East. To make matters worse, Chiang's government instituted poor fiscal policies to cover short-term necessities, sparking rapid inflation. These compounding problems left both the military and civilian populations destitute. Poverty and financial collapse led to widespread corruption within the army, where hoarding and graft became rampant. Malnutrition set in. And the lack of any nationalist offensive against the Japanese caused the Chinese armed forces to swiftly deteriorate. Quickly, the brief spike in support for Chiang's government that they experienced at the start of the war was winnowed away to nothing. And yet, despite their profound suffering, the people of free China refused to surrender to imperial forces. As the main opposition to Japan struggled in the West, the communists in the North and the East saw their fortunes improving. The local governments they created frequently encouraged mass participation in party activities. And having instituted land reforms, they pulled a great many peasant farmers over to their side with an improved standard of living. Japan's attempts at erecting a civilian puppet regime continued to flounder in the territories it controlled. Their troubles with recruitment remained a constant concern, and the few Chinese civilians willing to work with Japan were rarely seen as reliable leaders and bureaucrats. In early 1944, relief finally came in the form of material shipments from the United States. Nationalist soldiers trained to become pilots and mechanics, receiving support from the Allies. American and Chinese joint air operations dropped bombs on previously impenetrable Japanese holdfasts. Even so, Chiang's troops were far from ready to mount a grand campaign against occupying forces. After 7 years of war and poor governance, the nationalists were left ineffective and unpopular. At the same time, the communist forces had only grown. As America fought the war in the Pacific and drew Japanese troops away from China, the Reds were all too happy to move into the vacuum they left behind. In the summer of 1945, Japan found itself in a familiar position, staring down the barrel of an American cannon. Once again, almost exactly 100 years after Commodore Perry opened up Japan, American warships were flocking to Japanese shores. At the end of July 1945, the Imperial Japanese Navy was no longer able to conduct major defensive operations. Allied forces were set to invade Japan's home islands. In public, the Japanese government expressed its determination to keep fighting. Privately, they were reaching out to the Soviet Union in hopes that Stalin and Molotov would act as mediators between them and the US. What happened next made all of this posturing seem infantile in comparison. Between August 5th and August 10th, 1945, 3 things happened. First, the United States dropped the first A-bomb on Hiroshima. The city was a supply and logistics hub for Japanese armed forces, and most importantly, housed the headquarters for the 2nd General Army, which had been tasked with commanding the defense of all southern Japan. The bomb's detonation marked the first use of nuclear weapons in the theater of war. The massive blast and subsequent fallout killed between 90,000 and 146,000 people, most of whom were civilians. Second, on August 9th, the Soviet Union mounted a full-scale invasion of Manchuria, which would only last 11 days. In that time, the Soviets confounded Japanese expectations with a series of surprise maneuvers. Despite only having 11 days, the Soviets managed to march through all of Manchuria, eventually stopping at the 38th parallel, wiping out Japanese control of the region. Third, also on August 9th, US troops dropped a second nuke on Japan, this time targeting Nagasaki, killing between 60 and 80,000. Having taken one more blow than they could handle, the Japanese High Command made a decision. For the very first time on August 15th, 1945, Japan and its 77 million citizens heard their emperor's voice on the radio. To our good and loyal subjects, after pondering deeply the general trends of the world and the actual conditions obtaining in our empire today, we have decided to effect a settlement of the present situation by resorting to an extraordinary measure. We have ordered our government to communicate to the governments of the United States, Great Britain, China, and the Soviet Union that our empire accepts the provisions of their joint declaration. Though he did not use the word surrender, the intention was clear. By accepting the Potsdam Declaration, he was offering unconditional acquiescence to every single Allied demand. The war was over. Manchuria was now under active Soviet occupation, along with most of Mongolia. Puppet leaders previously employed by Japan were either captured by Soviet troops or fled to distant lands. Immediately, China's 2 remaining factions began a mad dash for the territory the Japanese had abandoned. Interestingly, at this point in the war, Chiang Kai-shek and his nationalist troops were receiving support from both the US and the Soviet Union. Chiang's support from Stalin was conditioned on the USSR's retention of control over Port Arthur. But this was not necessarily his to guarantee. Mao's troops dominated the north and had control over the northeastern lands bordering the Soviet-occupied zone. The United States temporarily landed 50,000 troops in Beijing to hold down the fort, as 100,000 nationalist troops were flown in. The nationalists, apparently unconcerned for their reputation, began forcibly conscripting the local citizenry, looting local homes, and governing just as poorly in the eastern city as they had in the west for so many years. Needless to say, communist power only grew as a result as the rural peasants flocked to Mao. The nationalists, using U.S. military transport facilities, were quick to sweep up strategically valuable cities and grab rail lines as the Japanese evacuated. But they suffered from the same problem the Japanese experienced. Communist guerrillas occupied vast tracts of rural land and were essentially free to torment Chiang Kai-shek's troops exactly as they had the Japanese. Back in 1945, the Soviets had agreed to end their occupation of Manchuria in exchange for Chinese recognition of the Soviet-aligned Mongolian People's Republic. Suddenly, fearing the total extinction of the Chinese Communist Party, the USSR began to tip away from the nationalists. In 1946, as they were leaving, the Soviets handed the enormous stockpiles of Japanese weapons in Manchuria over to Mao's forces, triggering further conflict between the two Chinese parties in the north. The USSR then began providing the communists with in-depth intelligence on nationalist troop movements, giving Mao a significant edge in the fight. The nationalists were caught up in further missteps as they began to work with Japanese generals. These former enemy commanders were responsible for the deaths of hundreds of thousands of Chinese citizens, who they killed through the use of scorched earth tactics in the north. Despite the negative impact on their reputation, the nationalists protected these war criminals, who began to work closely with Chiang as his advisors. Their refusal to turn over Japanese war criminals for prosecution, and their even closer association with the former blue-shirt Chinese fascists, resulted in a loss of support from the United States. The next nationalist offensive campaign against the communists saw them seize a major city at the untenable cost of 1 million troops. Despite urban losses, Mao now had an army of 5 million soldiers and could expand across rural reaches without high losses. By 1948, the communists began to capture major cities from Chiang's troops. Their losses meant little as they were able to immediately recruit more troops from the peasant population, a feat that nationalists could not achieve with their poor reputation. The communist advance south was sure-footed from there, and nationalist leaders began either fleeing to Taiwan or defecting to the communist cause. On October 1st, 1949, from the new capital of Beijing, Mao proclaimed the establishment of the People's Republic of China. The Allied occupation of Japan was plotted out in a series of conferences before Japanese surrender. The Allies, China, Britain, the USSR, and the United States, put particular attention into how Japan would be disarmed, how to prevent future remilitarization, how its colonies would be managed, and how its economy would be stabilized. And while the other Allied nations had a say in what reforms were implemented, the nation was, first and foremost, occupied by troops of the United States. In September of 1945, U.S. General MacArthur was appointed Supreme Allied Commander of Japan, placing him in charge of what would become a 7-year-long occupation. Having received his command, MacArthur plotted out his strategy for reforming the Japanese society. First, destroy the military power, punish war criminals, build the structure of representative government, modernize the Constitution, hold free elections, enfranchise the women, release the political prisoners, liberate the farmers, establish a free labor movement, encourage free economy, abolish police oppression, develop a free and responsible press, liberalize education, decentralize the political power, separate church from state. Japan's refusal to surrender until the last possible moment meant the destruction of an exceptional amount of the nation's infrastructure. Firebombing campaigns and supply shortages left the people of Japan physically and mentally exhausted. US B-29 bombers targeted manufacturing and transportation hubs. Major and minor cities were crippled under the weight of American military might. Tokyo had been all but destroyed after American air raids carpeted the city, killing more than 83,000 and leaving over 1 million homeless. By the end of the war, more than 600 major industrial facilities had been destroyed. As many as 500,000 Japanese citizens had been killed, and 8.5 million had no place to sleep at night. When the occupation began, 4.2 million new homes needed to be built. Transportation networks had to be restored. Schools and hospitals had to be constructed, and, most importantly, food production had to be reestablished. In the final years of the war, the average Japanese adult was living on just 1,042 calories per day, though in major urban areas like Tokyo, things were even worse, with people living on a little over 700 calories each day. Immediately, emergency wheat donations were shipped in from the US. The government higher-ups who had been involved with military affairs were largely purged from political office. 28 of these dismissed politicians found themselves in handcuffs, standing trial for war crimes in Tokyo. In total, only 7 officials were put to death, with 16 receiving life sentences. Emperor Hirohito, and indeed all members of the extended royal family, were spared prosecution, despite having committed a panoply of crimes during the war. Among those who went unpunished was the emperor's uncle, Prince Yasuhiko Asaka, who, as previously discussed, was responsible for the Nanjing massacre. In his place, Iwane Matsui was, controversially, held responsible despite having taken some actions that arguably would exonerate him. Shiroishi and his cronies escaped from justice by striking a deal with General MacArthur. To dodge prosecution, the scientists released all their illegal research findings to the US, which in turn covered up the truth of the horrors they committed. The reinstitution of a liberal democratic state began with a reduction in the role of the emperor. The monarchy became a figurehead, its powers largely transferred to the hands of the democratically elected leadership. Wealthy landlords who had previously owned the majority of agricultural properties in the country were made to sell vast quantities of land. In turn, this land was sold at cost to their previous tenant farmers, breaking apart the nation's heavily concentrated agricultural industry. The wealthy elites of Japan saw their bases of power partially destroyed as worker unions, antitrust legislation, and labor rights were all put in place. Elections were held with shocking speed, the first taking place on the 10th of April 1946. This election was the first in which Japanese women had the right to vote. 1 year after, Japan's new pacifist constitution was adopted. The document's ratification stripped away the nation's right to wage war and build up its military forces. The Constitution did allow for the creation of smaller Japanese self-defense forces, which would operate in conjunction with American troops to protect Japan from the rising communist threats to the west and north. Unsurprisingly, with one nation facing substantial international isolation and the other completely demilitarized, Sino-Japanese relations became notably less scintillating. Even so, in 1950, the Sino-Soviet Treaty of Friendship, Alliance, and Mutual Assistance was signed. Article 1 of the treaty was a mutual defense pact designed to prevent the revival of Japanese imperialism. In 1952, Japan recognized the government in Taiwan, aka the Republic of China, as the legitimate Chinese state. Despite this, the Japanese government exchanged trade, labor, and cultural delegations with Communist China in the 1950s to maintain diplomatic relations. In 1952, Mao's China and the Japanese government ratified their first trade deal. In 1958, Mao's government severed all trade ties with Japan out of frustration over Japan's support of the Republic of China. But these bonds were soon mended in 1960 out of desperation, after the Soviet Union broke its previously close ties with Communist China, forcing the nation to backtrack to defend its economy. In 1972, relations between Japan and Communist China were normalized with the signing of a joint communique. The document outlined 3 key points. First, Japan acknowledged its hand in causing great harm to the Chinese people during its invasion and occupation. In turn, China renounced its demands for war reparations. Second, Japan, at least on paper, recognized the Communist People's Republic of China as the only government of China, and agreed that Taiwan was an inalienable part of the territory of the People's Republic. And lastly, the agreement confirmed that the two countries would establish diplomatic relations, exchange ambassadors, and would negotiate agreements in trade, shipping, aviation, and fisheries. A long-term private trade agreement was signed by China and Japan in February of 1978. Under this deal, trade was meant to increase by $20 billion within the next 7 years, with Japan exporting production equipment, technology, construction materials, and machine parts in exchange for crude oil and coal. This ploy proved overly optimistic when, the following year, the Chinese were compelled to slow their development goals and scale down their financial obligations. Despite it being downgraded, the deal was a major milestone and demonstrated the two countries' dedication to normalization. From there, the story of relations between the two nations is one of investment and peaceful coexistence, with a few important caveats. Despite the comparatively muted relations the two countries had experienced over the past 70 years, the reality of China and Japan's sordid past shines through to today. In March of 2005, 17 Chinese cities erupted in protest. The angry citizens weren't reprimanding their leaders or demanding domestic change. Rather, their anger was turned outward. The mass demonstrations were directed against Japan. The angry mobs, several thousand strong, marched on Japanese consulates throughout the country, threw rocks through the Japanese embassy's windows in Beijing, and filled the streets with chants of "boycott Japanese businesses." Why? The reason wasn't exactly clear. Some protesters were expressing outrage over new Japanese history textbooks that grossly understated Japanese war crimes during the Second World War. Others were enraged at the recent G4 proposal, requesting Japan be given a seat on the UN Security Council. Many others were simply content to toss eggs at Japanese restaurants and grocery stores, expressing a generalized sense of rage that they felt towards the island nation. Outraged, the Japanese government demanded financial restitution for the damages suffered, condemned the violence that broke out, and not much else. The curious spat of unrest could have been ignored. But then, in August of 2012, it happened again, even larger than before. This time, the cause was a bit more obvious. The CCP had whipped up its citizenry into a blind rage over a territorial dispute concerning the small, uninhabited Japanese-owned Senkaku Islands, which China claims as their territory. The first bout of protests sprung up after two activists from Hong Kong who had sailed to the islands were detained by the Japanese Coast Guard. The demonstrators, reportedly calling for their government to cease trade with Japan and retake the islands by force, marched across the city of Shenzhen. As they walked, the angry mob smashed Japanese cars, burned the Japanese flag, and vandalized any stores selling products made in Japan. In the end, hordes of armed police were sent in to disperse the furious crowds, arresting several protesters in the process. Events with varying levels of intensity took place in 9 other cities, but tensions briefly cooled. Until the 11th of September, when China sent 2 ships to the island to assert their claim of ownership. Japan promptly nationalized the Senkaku Islands, and 4 days later, a second barrage of protests began. These demonstrations, even larger than the ones earlier in the year, quickly ballooned beyond the bounds of state control. The cities of Changsha and Qingdao were the first to see instances of arson and mass vandalism. Once again, across the country, Japanese cars were smashed. A Toyota Motors outlet was set on fire, as were 2 Panasonic factories in Suzhou and Shandong. 2 Japanese department stores in Qingdao and Changsha were plundered by rogue demonstrators. Thousands of malcontents busted their way into the Garden Hotel in Guangzhou, where the Japanese consulate was housed. In Shenyang, an angry mob threw bottles of ink at the Japanese consulate's pristine white walls. On September 18th, another group surrounded U.S. Ambassador Gary Locke's car, refusing to let him enter the Japanese embassy. When all was said and done, 180 cities saw mass events in which protesters vented their rage and called for a boycott of all Japanese-made goods. With Chinese power on the rise and Japan in a comparatively pacified state, one may inevitably be forced to ask hard questions. Questions like, can Japan be bullied into submission? And if the answer is yes, what does that mean for the sovereignty of free nations living in the shadow of authoritarian China? Will the governments of democratic states in East Asia be allowed to govern for their people? Or will they be put in the same position that China found itself in so many years ago? Forced to bow to the whims of imperialist powers willing to abuse human rights to maintain their own power. Despite its centuries-long hiatus, China is, once again, the powerhouse of the East, and those wishing to maintain their power in the Chinese Communist Party have proven time and time again that they have no qualms about inflaming violent nationalism to distract their citizens from increasingly authoritarian rule at home. There are many alive today who can recall the horrors visited upon the Chinese people at the hands of the Japanese Empire. There are even more who grew up hearing stories of what happened from their parents, their grandparents, and their great-grandparents. Such a large population with such an intimately close connection to the crimes that were committed will not be willing to forgive and forget anytime soon. And though the old militaristic regime that once ruled an empire has been dead in the ground for 78 years, the people of China will never see the promise of the liberal democratic society that so aptly replaced it. For as long as an authoritarian government rules in China, her people will remain in darkness, never seeing the light of truth that a free nation can provide.